young man, who was again pacing the room, at length replied, "I am not rich, and I regret it for your sake." Then matters went from bad to worse. The quarrel assumed quite conjugal violence. "Say that I love you for your money," cried she, with all the bluntness of her mother, whose very words seemed to come to her lips. "I am a money-loving woman, am I not? Well, yes, I am a money-loving woman, because I am a sensible woman. It is no use pretending the contrary. Money will ever be money in spite of everything. As for me, whenever I have had 20 sous, I have always pretended that I had 40, for it is better to create envy than pity." He interrupted her to say in a weary voice, like a man who only desires peace, "Listen, if it annoys you so much that it's a llama shawl, I will give you one in Chantilly."
"Your shawl,"
continued she in a regular fury.
"why, I've already forgotten all about your shawl."
"The other things are what exasperate me, understand? Oh, moreover, you're just like my husband. You wouldn't care a bit if I hadn't a pair of boots to go out in. Yet when one loves a woman, good nature alone should prompt one to feed and dress her. But no man will ever understand that. Why, between the two of you, you would soon let me go out with nothing on but my chemise if I was agreeable." Octave, tired out by this domestic squabble, decided not to answer, having noticed that Auguste sometimes got rid of her in that way. He let pass the flow of words, and thought of the ill luck of his amours. Yet he had ardently desired this one, even to the point of upsetting all his calculations, and, now that she was in his room, it was to quarrel with him, to make him pass a sleepless night, as though they had already left 6 months of married life behind them. And full of conciliation, without desire but polite, he tried to kiss her. She pushed him away and burst into tears. "Go on, reproach me also with my outings," stammered she in the midst of her sobs. "Accuse me of being too great an expense to you." "Oh, I see clearly now. It's all on account of that wretched present. If you could shut me up in a box, you would do so." "I have lady friends. I go to call on them. That is no crime. And as for mamma, for heaven's sake, leave your mamma alone," interrupted Octave, "and allow me to tell you that she has given you a precious bad temper." She mechanically commenced to undress herself, and becoming more and more excited, she raised her voice. "Mamma has always done her duty. It's not for you to speak of her here. I forbid you to mention her name. It only remained for you to attack my family." Finding a difficulty in undoing the string of her petticoat, she broke it. Then, seating herself on the edge of the bed, her bosom heaving with anger in the midst of the surrounding lace of her chemise, she continued, "Ah, how I regret my weakness, sir! How one would reflect if one could only foresee everything." Octave, who had made a show of lying with his face to the wall, suddenly bounced round, exclaiming, "What? You regret having loved me? Most certainly, a man incapable of understanding a woman's heart." And they looked at each other close together, with hardened faces, quite devoid of love. "Good heavens! If it were only to come over again," added she. "You would take another, wouldn't you?" said he, brutally, and in a very low voice. She was about to answer Finn the same exasperated tone when there came a sudden hammering at the door. Not understanding at first what it meant, they remained immovable, and their blood seemed to freeze in their veins. A hollow voice said, "Open the door. I can hear you at your dirty tricks. Open, or I will burst it in." It was the husband's voice. Still the lovers did not move. Their heads were filled with such a buzzing that they could think of nothing, and they felt very cold, just like corpses. Bertha at length jumped from the bed with an instinctive desire to fly from her lover, whilst on the other side of the door Auguste repeated, "Open, open, I say." Then ensued a terrible confusion, an inexpressible anguish. Bertha turned about the room in a state of distraction, seeking for some outlet with a fear of death which made her turn ghastly pale. Octave, whose heart jumped to his mouth at each blow, had gone and mechanically leant against the door as though to strengthen it. The noise was becoming unbearable. The fool would wake the whole house up. He would have to open the door. But when she understood his determination, she hung onto his arms, imploring him with terrified eyes. No, no, mercy! The other would rush upon them with a pistol or a knife. He, as pale as herself and partly overcome by her fright, slipped on his trousers and beseeched her to dress herself. Still bewildered, she only managed to put on her stockings. All this time the husband continued his uproar. "You won't, you don't answer. Very well, you'll see." Ever since he had last paid his rent, Octave had been asking his landlord for some slight repairs, 2 new screws in the staple of his lock, which scarcely held to the wood. Suddenly the door cracked, the staple yielded, and Auguste, unable to stop himself, rolled into the middle of the room. "Damnation!" swore he. He simply held a key in his hand, which was bleeding through becoming grazed in his fall. When he got up, livid and filled with rage and shame at the thought of his ridiculous entry, he hit out into space and wished to spring upon Octave. But the latter, in spite of the awkwardness of being barefooted and having his trousers all awry, seized him by the wrists and, being the stronger of the two, mastered him, at the same time exclaiming, "Sir, you are violating my domicile. It is disgraceful. You should act like a gentleman." And he almost beat him. During their short struggle, Bertha had made off in her chemise by the door which had remained wide open. She fancied she beheld a kitchen knife in her husband's bleeding fist, and she seemed to feel the cold steel between her shoulders. As she rushed along the dark passage, she thought she heard the sound of blows, without being able to make out who had dealt them or who received them. Voices, which she no longer recognized, were saying, "I am at your service whenever you please." "Very well, you will hear from me." With a bound she gained the servants' staircase. But when she had rushed down the 2 flights, as though there had been the flames of a conflagration behind her, she found the kitchen door locked, and remembered she had left the key upstairs in the pocket of her dressing gown. Moreover, there was no lamp, not the least glimmer of a light beneath the door. It was evidently the servant who had sold them. Without stopping to take breath, she tore upstairs again, passing once more before the passage leading to Octave's room, where the 2 men's voices still continued in violent altercation. They were going on abusing each other. She would have time, perhaps. And she rapidly descended the grand staircase with the hope that her husband had left their outer door open. She would bolt herself in her room and open to nobody. But there, for the 2nd time, she encountered a locked door. Then, shut out from her home with scarcely a covering to her body, she lost her head and scampered from floor to floor like some hunted animal which knows not where to take earth. She would never have the courage to knock at her parents' door. At one moment she thought of taking refuge with the doorkeepers, but shame drove her upstairs again. She listened, raised her head, bent over the handrail, her ears deafened by the beating of her heart in the profound silence, her eyes blinded by lights which seemed to shoot out from the dense obscurity. And it was always the knife in Auguste's bleeding fist, the icy cold point of which was about to pierce her. Suddenly there was a noise. She fancied he was coming, and she shivered to her very marrow, and, as she was opposite Campardin's door, she rang desperately, furiously, almost breaking the bell. "Good heavens, is the house on fire?" asked an agitated voice inside. The door opened at once. It was Lisa, who was only then leaving Mademoiselle, walking softly and with a candlestick in her hand. The mad ringing of the bell had made her start, just as she was crossing the anteroom. When she caught sight of Bertha in her chemise, she stood rooted to the spot. "What's the matter?" asked she. The young woman had entered, violently slamming the door behind her, and, panting and leaning against the wall, she stammered out, "Hush! Keep quiet! He wants to kill me." Lisa was trying to get a sensible explanation from her when Camperdown appeared, looking very anxious. This incomprehensible uproar had disturbed Gasparine and him in their narrow bed. He had simply slipped on his trousers, and his fat face was swollen and covered with perspiration, whilst his yellow beard was quite flaccid and full of the white down of the pillow. He was all out of breath and endeavoring to assume the assurance of a husband who sleeps alone. "Is that you, Lisa?" called he from the drawing-room. "It's absurd. How is it you're not upstairs?" "I was afraid I had not fastened the door properly, sir. I could not sleep for thinking of it, so I came down to make sure. But it's Madame." The architect, seeing Bertha leaning against the wall of his anteroom with nothing but her chemise on, stood lost in amazement also. Bertha forgot how scantily she was clad. "Oh, sir, keep me here," repeated she. "He wants to kill me." "Who does?" asked he. "My husband." The cousin now put in an appearance behind the architect. She had taken time to don a dress, and her hair untidy and also full of down, her breast flat and hanging, her bones almost protruding through her garment, she brought with her the rancor arising from her interrupted repose. The sight of the young woman, of her plump and delicate nudity, only increased her ill humor. "Whatever have you done, then, to your husband?" she asked. At this simple question Bertha was overcome by a great shame. She remembered she was half naked and blushed from head to foot. In this long thrill of shame she crossed her arms over her bosom as though to escape the glances directed at her, and she stammered out, "He found me! He caught me! He caught me!" The two others understood and looked at each other with indignation in their eyes. Lisa, whose candle lighted up the scene, pretended to share her master's reprehension. At this moment, however, the explanation was interrupted by Angèle also hastening to the spot, and she pretended to have just woke up, rubbing her eyes heavy with sleep. The sight of the lady with nothing on her but a chemise suddenly brought her to a standstill with a jerk, a quivering of her precocious young girl's slender body. "Oh!" she simply exclaimed. "It's nothing. Go back to bed," cried her father. Then, understanding that some sort of story was necessary, he related the first that came into his head, but it was really too ludicrous. "Madame sprained her ankle coming downstairs, so she's come here for assistance. Go back to bed, you'll catch cold." Lisa choked back a laugh on encountering Angèle's wide-open eyes, as the latter returned to her bed all rosy and quite delighted at having seen such a sight. For some minutes past, Madame Camperdown had been calling from her room. She had not put her light out, being so interested in her Dickens, and she wished to know what had happened. What did it all mean? Who was there? Why did not someone come to set her mind at rest? "Come, madame," said the architect, taking Bertha with him. "And you, Lisa, wait a minute." In the bedroom, Rose was still spread out in the middle of the big bed. She throned there with her queenly luxury, her quiet serenity of an idol. She was deeply affected by what she had read, and she had placed the book on her breast, with the heavings of which it gently rose and fell. When the cousin in a few words had made her acquainted with what had taken place, she also appeared to be scandalized. How could one go with a man who was not one's husband? And she was filled with disgust for that which was denied to her. But the architect now cast confused glances at the young woman, and this ended by making Gasparine blush. "It is shocking!" cried she. "Cover yourself up, madame, for it is really shocking." "Pray cover yourself up." And she herself threw a shawl of roses over Bertha's shoulders, a large knitted woolen shawl which was lying about. It did not reach to her knees, however, and in spite of himself the architect's eyes wandered over the young woman's person. Bertha was still trembling. Though she was in safety, she kept starting and looking toward the door. Her eyes were full of tears, and she beseeched this lady, who seemed so calm and comfortable as she lay in bed. "Oh, madame, keep me, save me, he wants to kill me." A pause ensued. The three were consulting one another with their eyes, without hiding their disapproval of such culpable conduct. Besides, it was not proper to come in a state of nudity and wake people up after midnight, and perhaps put them to great inconvenience. No, such a thing was not right. It showed a want of discretion, besides placing them in a very awkward position. "We have a young girl here," said Gasparine at length. "Think of our responsibility, madame." "You would be better with your parents," insinuated the architect, "and if you will allow me to see you to their door." Bertha was again seized with terror. "No, no." "He is on the stairs. He would kill me." And she implored him to let her remain. A chair was all she needed to wait on till morning. On the morrow she would go quietly away. The architect and his wife would have consented, he won over by such tender charms, she interested by the drama of this surprise in the middle of the night. But Gasparine remained inflexible. Yet she had her curiosity to satisfy, and she ended by asking, "Wherever were you?" "Upstairs, in the room at the end of the passage, you know." At this, Camperdown held up his arms and exclaimed, "What? With Octave? It isn't possible. With Octave, with that beanstalk, such a pretty, plump little woman." He was annoyed. Rose also felt vexed, and was now inclined to be severe. As for Gasparine, she was quite beside herself, stung to the heart by her instinctive hatred of the young man. He again! She knew very well that he had them all, but she was certainly not going to be so stupid as to keep them warm for him in her home. "Put yourself in our place," resumed she harshly. "I tell you again, we have a young girl here." "Besides," said Camperdown in his turn, "there is the house to be considered. There is your husband, with whom I have always been on the best of terms. He would have a right to be surprised. It will never do for us to appear to publicly approve your conduct, madame." "Oh, a conduct which I do not permit myself to judge, but which is rather, what shall I say? Rather indiscreet, is it not?" "We are certainly not going to cast stones at you," continued Rose. "Only the world is so wicked, people will say that you had your meetings here. And, you know, my husband works for some very straight-laced people. At the least stain on his morality, he would lose everything. But allow me to ask you, madame, how is it you were not restrained by religion? The Abbé Maudouet was talking to us of you quite paternally, only the day before yesterday." Bertha turned her head about between the three of them, looking at the one who spoke in a bewildered sort of way. In the midst of her fright she was beginning to understand. She felt surprised at being there. Why had she rang? What was she doing amongst these people whom she disturbed? She saw them clearly now. The wife occupying the whole width of the bed, the husband in his drawers, and the cousin in a thin skirt, the pair of them white with the feathers of the same pillow. They were right. It was not proper to tumble amongst people in that way. And as the architect pushed her gently toward the anteroom, she went off without even answering Rose's religious regrets. "Shall I accompany you as far as your parents' door?" asked Camperdown. "Your place is with them," she refused with a terrified gesture. "Then wait a moment. I will take a look up and down the stairs, for I should deeply regret if the least harm happened to you." Lisa had remained in the middle of the anteroom with her candle. He took it, went out onto the landing, and returned almost immediately. "I assure you there is no one. Run up quick." Then Bertha, who had not again opened her lips, hastily took off the woolen shawl and threw it on the floor, saying, "Here, this is yours." "It's no use keeping it, as he's going to kill me." And she went out into the darkness with nothing on but her chemise, the same as when she came. Camperdown double-locked the door in a fury, murmuring the while, "Eh, go and get tumbled elsewhere." Then, as Lisa burst out laughing behind him, he added, It's true they'd be coming every night if one received them, every one for himself. I would have given her 100 francs, but my reputation, no, by Jove. In the bedroom, Rose and Gasparine were recovering themselves. Had anyone ever seen such a shameless creature? To walk about the staircase with nothing on. Really? There were women who respected nothing at certain times. But it was close upon 2 o'clock they must get to sleep, and they embraced again. "Good night, my darling. Good night, my duck." Was it not nice to love each other, and to always agree together when one beheld such catastrophes occurring in other families? Rose again took up her Dickens. He supplied all her requirements. She would read a few more pages, then let the book slip into the bed, the same as she did every night, and fall off asleep, weary with emotion. Campardon followed Gasparine, made her get into bed. Sheets had become cold again. They were not at all comfortable. It would take them another half-hour to get warm. And Lisa, who, before going upstairs, had returned to Angele's room, was saying to her, "The lady has sprained her ankle. Come, show me how she sprained it." "Why, like this," replied the child, throwing herself on the maid's neck and kissing her on her lips. Berthe was on the stairs shivering. It was cold. The heating apparatus was not lighted till the beginning of November. Her fright had at length abated. She had gone down and listened at her door. Nothing, not a sound. Then she had gone up, not daring to venture as far as Octave's room, but listening from a distance. There was a death-like silence, unbroken by a murmur. Suddenly a noise affrighted her, causing her to jump up, and she was about to hammer with both her fists on her mother's door, when someone calling out stopped her. It was a voice almost as faint as a zephyr. "Madam, madam." She looked downstairs but saw nothing. "Madam, madam, it's I." And Marie showed herself in her chemise also. She had heard all the disturbance and had slipped out of bed, leaving Jules asleep, whilst she remained listening in her little dining room without a light. "Come in, you are in trouble." "I am a friend." She gently reassured her and told her all that had taken place. The men had not hurt each other. He had cursed and swore, and pushed the chest of drawers up against his door to shut himself in, whilst the other had gone downstairs with a bundle in his hand, the things she had left behind, her shoes and petticoat, which she must have rolled up mechanically in her dressing-gown, on seeing them lying about. In short, it was all over. It would be easy enough to prevent them fighting on the morrow. But Bertha remained standing on the threshold with a remnant of fear and shame at thus entering the abode of a lady whom she did not habitually frequent. Marie was obliged to lead her in by the hand. "You will sleep there on that sofa. I will lend you a shawl, and I will go and see your mother. Good heavens, what a misfortune! When one is in love, one does not stop to think." "Ah, for the little pleasure we had," said Bertha with a sigh, which was full of the cruelty and stupidity of her unprofitable night. "He does right to swear. If he's like me, he's had more than enough of it." They were on the point of speaking of Octave. They said nothing further, but suddenly fell sobbing into each other's arms in the dark. Their limbs clasped with a convulsive passion, their bosoms hot with tears, were pressed close together beneath their crumpled chemises. It was a final weariness, an immense sadness, the end of everything. They did not say another word, whilst their tears flowed without ceasing, in the midst of the darkness and of the profound slumber of that house so full of decency. Chapter 15. That morning the house awoke with a great middle-class dignity. Nothing of the staircase preserved a trace of the scandals of the night, neither the imitation marble which had reflected that gallop of a woman in her chemise, nor the Wilton carpet from which all the odor of her semi-nudity had evaporated. Monsieur Gourde alone, when he went upstairs towards 7 o'clock to give his look round, sniffed at the walls. But what did not concern him, and as, on going downstairs again, he saw two of the servants in the courtyard, Lisa and Julie, who were no doubt discussing the catastrophe, for they seemed deeply interested, he stared at them so fixedly that they at once separated. Then he went outside to make sure of the tranquillity of the street. It was calm. Only the servants must already have been talking, for some of the neighbors' wives stopped. Tradespeople came to their shop doors, looking up in the air, examining and searching the different floors, in the gaping way in which the crowd scrutinizes houses where a crime has been committed. In the presence of the rich frontage, however, people held their tongues and politely passed on. At 7:30, Madame Jouzer appeared in a dressing gown to look after Louise, she said. Her eyes sparkled and her hands were feverishly hot. She stopped Marie, who was going up with her milk, and endeavored to get her to talk, but she could draw nothing out of her and did not even learn how the mother had received her guilty daughter. Then, under the pretense of waiting a minute for the postman, she entered the Gord's room and ended by asking why Monsieur Octave did not come down. Perhaps he was ill. The doorkeeper replied that he did not know. Moreover, Monsieur Octave never came down before 10 minutes past 8. At this moment, the other Madame Camperdown, pale and erect, passed by. Everyone bowed to her. And Madame Jouzer, obliged to go upstairs again, had the luck, on reaching the landing, to meet the architect just starting off and putting on his gloves. At first they both looked at each other in a dejected sort of way. Then he shrugged his shoulders.
Poor things,
murmured she. No, it serves them right, said he ferociously. An example must be made of them. A fellow whom I introduce into a respectable house, beseeching him not to bring any women there, and who, to humbug me, goes and sleeps with the landlord's sister-in-law. I look like a fool in it all. No more was said. Madame Jouzer entered her apartments whilst Camperdown continued on his way downstairs in such a state of fury that he tore one of his gloves. Just as 8 o'clock was striking, Auguste, looking very dejected, his features contracted by an atrocious headache, crossed the courtyard to go to his warehouse. Filled with shame and dreading to meet anyone, he had come down by way of the servants' staircase. However, he could not leave his business to take care of itself. When, in the midst of his counters, and before the pay-desk where Bertha usually sat, his emotion almost choked him. The porter was taking down the shutters, and Auguste was giving the orders for the day, when the abrupt appearance of Saturnin coming up from the basement gave him an awful fright. The madman's eyes were like flames of fire, his white teeth resembled a famished wolf's. He went straight up to the husband, clenching his fists. "Where is she? If you touch her, I'll bleed you to death like a pig." Auguste drew back, exasperated. "Here's this one now. Shut up, or I'll bleed you," repeated Saturnin, making a rush at him. Then the husband preferred to beat a retreat. He had a horror of madmen. One could not reason with such people. But, as he went out into the porch, calling to the porter to shut Saturnin up in the basement, he found himself face to face with Valerie and Théophile. The latter, who had caught a frightful cold, was wrapped up in a big red comforter and coughed and moaned. They must both have known everything, for they stopped before Auguste with an air of condolence. Since the quarrel about the inheritance, the two couples had been sworn enemies, and were no longer on speaking terms. "You still have a brother," said Théophile, shaking him by the hand when he had finished coughing. "I wish you to remember it in your misfortune." "Yes," added Valerie, "this ought to avenge me, for she said some filthy things to me, did she not? But we pity you all the same, for we are not quite heartless." Augusta, deeply touched by their kind manner, led them to the end of his warehouse, keeping an eye on Saturnin, who was prowling about, and there their reconciliation became complete. Berthe's name was not mentioned, only Valerie allowed it to be understood that all the unpleasantness arose from that woman, for there never had been a disagreeable word said in the family till she had entered it to dishonor them. Auguste, his eyes cast on the ground, listened and nodded his head approvingly. And a certain gaiety gleamed beneath Theophile's commiseration, for he was delighted at no longer being the only one, and he examined his brother's face to see how a person looks when in that awkward position. "Now, what have you decided to do?" inquired he. "To challenge him, of course," firmly replied the husband. Theophile's joy was spoilt. His wife and he became cooler in the presence of Auguste's courage. The latter related to them the frightful scene of the night. How, having been foolish enough to hesitate purchasing a pistol, he had been forced to content himself with merely slapping the gentleman's face, and, to tell the truth, the gentleman had done the same to him, but that did not prevent his having received a pretty good hiding. A scoundrel who had been making a fool of him for 6 months past by pretending to take his part against his wife, and whose impudence had gone as far as making reports respecting her on the days she went out. As for her, the creature, as she had gone to her parents, she could remain with them. He would never take her back. Would you believe that last month I allowed her 300 francs for her dress? Cried he. I, who am so kind, so tolerant, who had decided to put up with everything sooner than make myself ill. But one cannot put up with that. No, no, one cannot. Theophile was thinking of death. He trembled feverishly and almost choked as he said, "It's absurd, you will get spitted." "I would not fight." And as Valerie looked at him, he added in an embarrassed manner, "If such a thing happened to me." "Ha! The wretched woman!" Then murmured his wife, "When one thinks that 2 men are going to kill each other on account of her, in her place I could never sleep again." Auguste remained firm. He would fight. Moreover, his plans were settled. As he particularly wished Duveyrier to be second, he was going up to inform him of what had taken place, and to send him at once to Octave. Valerie, who was most obliging to Auguste, ended by offering to attend at the pay desk, to give him time to find a suitable person. "Only," added she, "I must take Camille to the Tuileries Gardens toward 2 o'clock." "Oh, it does not matter for once in a way," said her husband. "It's raining, too. No, no, the child wants air. I must go out." At length the 2 brothers went up to the Duveyriers, but an abominable fit of coughing obliged Théophile to stop on the very first stair. He held on the handrail, and, when he was able to speak, though still with a slight rattle in his throat, he stammered, "You know, I'm very happy now. I'm quite sure of her. No, I've not the least thing to reproach her with, and she has given me proofs." Auguste stared at him without comprehending, and saw how yellow and half dead he looked, with the scanty hairs of his beard drying up in his flabby flesh. The look completed Théophile's annoyance, whilst he felt quite embarrassed by his brother's valor. "I am speaking of my wife," he resumed. "Ah, poor old fellow, I pity you with all my heart. You recollect my stupidity on your wedding day, but with you there can be no mistake, as you saw them." "Bah!" said Auguste, doing the brave. "I'll spit him like a lark." "On my word, I shouldn't care a hang if I hadn't such a headache." Just as they rang at the Duveyriers' door, Théophile suddenly thought that very likely the counsellor would not be in, for since the day he had found Clarisse he had been drifting into bad habits, and had now even got to the point of sleeping out. Hippolyte, who opened the door to them, avoided answering with respect to his master, but he said that the gentleman would find Madame playing her scales. They entered. Clotilde, tightly laced up from the moment she got out of bed, was seated at her piano, practicing with a regular and continuous movement of her hands, and, as she went in for this kind of exercise for 2 hours every day, so as not to lose the lightness of her touch, she occupied her mind in another way, by reading the Revue des Deux Mondes, which stood open on the piano before her, without the agility of her fingers being in any way hampered. "Why, it's you!" said she, when her brothers had drawn her from the volley of notes which isolated and enveloped her like a storm of hail. and she did not even show her surprise when she caught sight of Théophile. The latter, moreover, kept himself very stiff, like a man who had come on another's account. Auguste, filled with shame at the thought of telling his sister of his misfortune, and afraid of terrifying her with his duel, had a story all ready. But she did not give him time to lie. She questioned him in her quiet way after looking at him intently. "What do you intend doing now?" He started and blushed. "So everyone knew it then?" And he answered in the brave tone which had already closed Théophile's mouth, "Why, fight, of course." "Ah," said she, greatly surprised this time. However, she did not disapprove. It would increase the scandal, but yet honor had to be satisfied. She contented herself with recalling that she had at first opposed the marriage. One could expect nothing of a young girl who appeared to be ignorant of all a woman's duties. Then, as Auguste asked her where her husband was, "He is traveling," answered she, without the least hesitation. Then he was quite distressed, for he did not wish to do anything before consulting Duvarier. She listened to him, without mentioning the new address, unwilling to acquaint her family with her home troubles. At length she hit on an expedient. She advised him to go to Monsieur Bachelard in the Rue d'Anjou. Perhaps he would be able to tell him something. And she returned to her piano. "It's Auguste who asked me to come up," Théophile, who had not spoken until then, thought it necessary to declare. "Will you let me kiss you, Clotilda? We are all in trouble." She presented her cold cheek and said, "My poor fellow, only those are in trouble who choose to be. As for me, I forgive everyone. And take care of yourself. You seem to me to have a very had cough." Then, calling to Auguste, she added, "If the matter does not get settled, let me know, for I shall then be very anxious." The storm of notes recommenced, enveloping and drowning her, and, whilst her nimble fingers practised the scales in every key, she gravely resumed her reading of the Revue des Deux Mondes in the midst of it all. Downstairs, Auguste for a moment discussed the question whether he should go to Bachelard's or not. How could he say to him, "Your niece has deceived me"? At length he decided to obtain Duverrier's address from the uncle and to tell him nothing. Everything was settled. Valérie would look after the warehouse, whilst Théophile would watch the home until his brother's return. The latter had sent for a cab, and he was just going off, when Saturnin, who had disappeared a moment before, came up from the basement with a big kitchen knife, which he flourished about as he cried, I'll bleed him, I'll bleed him." This created another scare. Auguste, turning very pale, jumped precipitately into the cab and pulled the door to, saying, "He's got another knife." "Wherever does he find all those knives? I beseech you, Théophile, send him away. Try and arrange that he shall no longer be here when I come back." As though what has already happened were not bad enough for me. The porter had hold of the madman by his shoulders. Valérie told the driver the address. But he, a fat and filthy-looking man, with a face the color of bullock's blood, and still drunk from the night before, did not hurry himself, but took his time to gather up the reins and make himself comfortable on the box. "By distance, governor?" asked he in a hoarse voice. "No, by the hour, and quickly, please. There will be something handsome for yourself." In the Rue d'Anjou he met with another vexation. To begin with, the commission agent's doorway was so blocked up with vans that he almost got crushed. Then he found himself in the courtyard with the glass roof, amidst a crowd of packers all violently nailing up cases, and not one of whom could tell him where Bachelard was. The hammering seemed to split his skull. He was, however, making up his mind to wait for the uncle when an apprentice, pitying his suffering look, came and whispered an address in his ear. "Mademoiselle Fifi, Rue Saint-Marc." "Where do you say?" asked the driver, who had fallen asleep. "Rue Saint-Marc, and a little faster, if it's possible." The cab resumed its funereal crawl. On the boulevards the wheel caught in an omnibus. The panels cracked, the springs uttered plaintive cries. A gloomy melancholy more and more overcame the husband in his search of his second. However, they at last reached the Rue Saint-Marc. On the third floor, the door was opened by a little old woman, plump and white. She seemed suffering from some strong emotion, and she admitted Auguste directly. He asked for Monsieur Bachelard. "Ah, sir, you are one of his friends, surely. Pray try to calm him. Something happened to vex him a little while ago, the poor dear man. You know me, no doubt. He must have spoken to you of me. I am Mademoiselle Menu." Auguste, feeling quite scared, found himself in a narrow room overlooking the courtyard, and as clean and peaceful as a country home. One could almost detect the odor of order and work, the purity of the happy existence of people in a quiet way. Seated before an embroidery frame on which a priest's stole was stretched, a fair young girl, pretty and having a candid air, was weeping bitterly, whilst Uncle Bachelard, standing up, his nose inflamed, his eyes bloodshot, was drivelling with rage and despair. He was so upset that Auguste's entry did not appear to surprise him in the least. He immediately called upon him to bear witness, and the scene continued. "Come now, Monsieur Vabre, who are an honest man, what would you say in my place? I arrived here this morning a little earlier than usual. I entered her room with the sugar from the café and 3 4-sou pieces, just for a surprise for her, and I find her with that pig, Gouelin. No, there, frankly, what would you say?" Auguste, greatly embarrassed, turned very red. He at first thought that the uncle knew of his misfortune and was making a fool of him. But the other added, without even waiting for a reply, "Ah, listen, mademoiselle, you don't know what it is you have done. I, who was becoming young again, who felt so delighted at having found a nice, quiet little nook, where I was once more beginning to believe in happiness. Yes, you were an angel, a flower, in short, something fresh which helped me to forget a lot of dirty women." A genuine emotion contracted his throat. His voice choked in accents of profound suffering. Everything was crumbling away, and he wept for the loss of the ideal, with the hiccoughs of a remnant of drunkenness. "I did not know, uncle," stammered Fifi, whose sobs redoubled in presence of this pitiful spectacle. "No, I did not know it would cause you so much grief." And indeed she did not look as if she did know. She retained her ingenuous eyes, her odor of chastity, the naivete of a little girl unable as yet to distinguish a gentleman from a lady. Aunt Manu, moreover, swore that at heart she was innocent. "Do be calm, Monsieur Narcisse. She loves you well all the same. I felt that it would not be very agreeable to you. I said to her, if Monsieur Narcisse learns this, he will be annoyed. But she has scarcely lived as yet, has she? She does not know what pleases, nor what does not please. Do not weep any more, as her heart is always for you." As neither the child nor the uncle listened to her, she turned toward Auguste. She told him how much more anxious such an adventure made her feel for her niece's future. "Perhaps you know Villeneuve, near Lille," said she in conclusion. "I come from there. It is a pretty large town." But Auguste's patience was at an end. He shook himself free of the aunt, and turned toward Bachelard, whose noisy despair was calming down. "I came to ask you for Duverrier's new address. I suppose you know it." "Duverrier's address? Duverrier's address?" stammered the uncle. "You mean Clarice's address? Wait a moment." And he went and opened the door of Fifi's bedroom. Auguste was greatly surprised on seeing Gouelin, whom the old man had locked in, come forth. He had wished to give him time to dress himself, and also to detain him, so as to decide afterward what he would do with him. The sight of the young man looking all upset, his hair still unbrushed, revived his anger. "What, wretch! It's you, my nephew, who dishonors me. You soil your family, you drag my white hairs in the mire. Ah, you'll end badly. We shall see you one of these days in the dock of the assize court." Gouelin listened with bowed head, feeling at once both embarrassed and furious. "I say, uncle, you're going too far," murmured he. "There's a limit to everything. I don't think it funny either." Why did you bring me to see mademoiselle? I never asked you. You dragged me here. You drag everybody here. But Bachelard, again overcome with tears, continued, You've taken everything from me. I had only her left. You'll be the cause of my death, and I won't leave you a sou, not a sou. Then Guolin, quite beside himself, burst out, Go to the deuce. I've had enough of it. Ah, it's as I've always told you. Here they come, the annoyances of the morrow. See how it succeeds with me when, for once in a way, I've been fool enough to take advantage of an opportunity. Of course, the night was very pleasant, but afterward, go to blazes. One will be blubbering like a calf for the rest of one's life. I am in a great hurry, Auguste ventured to observe. Please give me the address, just the name of the street and the number. I require nothing further. The address, said the uncle. Wait a bit, directly. And, carried away by his feelings, which were overflowing, he caught hold of Guélin's hands. You ungrateful fellow, I was keeping her for you, on my word of honor. I said to myself, if he's good, I'll give her to him. Oh! In a proper manner, with a dowry of 50,000 francs. And, you dirty beast, you can't wait. You go and take her like that, all on a sudden. No, let me be, said Guélin, affected by the old chap's kindness of heart. I see very well that the annoyances are going to continue. But Bachelard dragged him before the young girl and asked her, Come now, Fifi, look at him. Would you have loved him? If it would have pleased you, uncle, answered she. This kind reply quite broke his heart. He wiped his eyes, blew his nose, and almost choked. Well, he would see. He had always wished to make her happy, and he suddenly sent Guélin off about his business. Be off. I will think about it. Just as Guélin was leaving, Bachelard called him back. Kiss her on the forehead, I permit it. And then he went himself and put him outside the door, after which he returned to Auguste, and placing his hand on his heart, he said, It's no joke. I give you my word of honor that I intended giving her to him later on. And the address? Asked the other, losing all patience. The uncle appeared surprised, as though he had answered him before. Eh? What? Clarice's address? Why, I don't know it. Auguste made an angry gesture. Everything was going wrong. There seemed to be a regular plot to render him ridiculous. Seeing him so upset, Bachelard made a suggestion. No doubt Troublot knew the address, and they might find him at his employer's, the stockbroker Des Marquet. And the uncle, with the obliging manner of one accustomed to knock about, offered to accompany his young friend. The latter accepted. Listen, said the uncle to Fifi after kissing her in his turn on the forehead. Here's the sugar from the café, all the same, and 3 4-sou bits for your money-box. Behave well whilst awaiting my orders. The young girl, looking very modest, continued drawing her needle with exemplary application. A ray of sunshine coming from over a neighboring roof enlivened the little room, gilded this nook of innocence into which the noise of the passing vehicles did not even penetrate. All the poetry of Bachelard's nature was stirred. May God bless you, Monsieur Narcissi, said Aunt Menu to him as she saw him to the door. I am more easy now. Only listen to the dictates of your heart, for it will inspire you. The driver had again fallen asleep, and he grumbled when the uncle gave him Monsieur Desmarquet's address in the Rue Saint-Lazare. No doubt the horse was asleep also, for it required quite a hail of blows to get him to move. At length the cab rolled painfully along. It's hard all the same, resumed the uncle after a pause. You can't imagine the effect it had on me when I saw Guélin in his shirt. No, one must have gone through such a thing to understand it. And he went on, entering into every detail, without noticing Auguste's increasing uneasiness. At length the latter, feeling his position becoming falser and falser, told him why he was in such a hurry to find Duveyrier. "Bertha with that counter-jumper!" cried the uncle. "You astonish me, sir." And it seemed that his astonishment was especially on account of his niece's choice. However, after a little reflection, he became very indignant. His sister Eleanor had a great deal to reproach herself with. He would have nothing more to do with the family. Of course, he was not going to mix himself up with the duel, but he considered it indispensable. Thus, just now when I saw Fifi with a man, my first thought was to murder everyone. If the same thing should ever happen to you. Pa! A painful start of Auguste's caused him to interrupt himself. "Ah, true, I was forgetting. My story does not interest you." Another pause ensued, whilst the cab swayed in a melancholy fashion. "I told you, Rue Saint-Lazare," called out the uncle to the driver. "It isn't at Chio. Turn to the left." At length the cab stopped. Out of prudence they sent up for Troublot, who came down bareheaded to talk to them in the doorway. "You know Clarice's address?" asked Bachelard.
Clarice's address? Why, of course.
"Rue d'Assas." They thanked him, and were about to re-enter their cab when Auguste asked in his turn, "What's the number?" "The number? Ah, I don't know the number." At this the husband declared that he preferred to give up seeing Duveyrier altogether. Troublot did all he could to try and remember. He had dined there once, it was just behind the Luxembourg, but he could not recollect whether it was at the end of the street or on the right or the left, but he knew the door well. Oh! He could have said at once, "That's it." Then the uncle had another idea. He begged him to accompany them in spite of Auguste's protestations, and his talking of returning home and not wishing to disturb anyone any further. Troublot, however, refused in a constrained manner. No, he would not trust himself in that hole again. "Well, I'm off, as Monsieur Troublot can't come," said Auguste, whose worries were increased by all these stories. But Troublot then declared that he would accompany them all the same, only he would not go up, he would merely show them the door. And after fetching his hat and giving a pretext for going out, he joined them in the cab. "Rue d'Assas," said he to the driver. "Straight down the street, I'll tell you when to stop." The driver swore. Rue d'Assas, by Jove, there were people who liked going about. However, they would get there when they did get there. The big white horse steamed away without making hardly any progress, his neck dislocated in a painful bow at every step. Bachelard was already relating his misfortune to Troublot. Such things always made him talkative. Yes, with that pig Guerlain, a most delicious little thing. But at this point of his story he recollected Auguste, who, gloomy and doleful, was sitting in a heap in a corner of the cab. "Ah, true, I beg your pardon," murmured he. "I keep forgetting." And, addressing Troublot, he added, "Our friend has met with a misfortune in his home also, and that is why we are trying to find Duveyrier." "Yes, he found his wife last night." He finished with a gesture, then added simply, "Octave, you know." Troublot, always plain-spoken, was about to say that it did not surprise him. Only he caught back his words and replaced them by others, full of disdainful anger, and the explanation of which the husband did not dare to ask him for. "What an idiot that Octave is," said he. At this appreciation of adultery there ensued another pause. Each of the three men was buried in his own reflections. The cab scarcely moved at all. It seemed to have been rolling for hours over a bridge, when Troublot, who was the first to emerge from his thoughts, ventured on making this judicious remark. "This cab doesn't get along very fast." But nothing could increase the horse's pace. It was 11 o'clock when they reached the Rue d'Assas. And there they wasted nearly another quarter of an hour, for, in spite of Troublot's boasts, he could not find the door. At first he allowed the driver to go along the street to the very end without stopping him. Then he made him drive up and down 3 times over. And on his precise indications, Auguste kept entering every 10th house, but the doorkeepers all answered that they knew no one of the name. At length the greengrocer pointed out the door to him. He went in with Bachelard, leaving Troublot in the cab. It was the big rascal of a brother who admitted them. He had a cigarette stuck between his lips and blew the smoke into their faces as he showed them into the drawing-room. When they asked for Monsieur Duveyrier, he stood looking at them in a jocular manner without answering. Then he disappeared, perhaps to fetch him. In the middle of the blue satin drawing-room, all luxuriously new yet already stained with grease, one of the sisters, the youngest, was seated on the carpet scouring out a saucepan which she had brought from the kitchen, whilst the other, the eldest, was hammering with her clenched fists on a magnificent piano, the key of which she had just found. On seeing the gentleman enter, they had both raised their heads. Neither, however, left off her occupation, but continued on the contrary, hammering and scouring more energetically than ever. 5 minutes passed, yet no one came. The visitors, feeling almost deafened, stood looking at each when some yells, issuing from a neighboring room, completely terrified them. It was the invalid aunt being washed. At length an old woman, Madame Bouquet, Clarice's mother, passed her head through a partly open door, not daring to show any more of her person because of the filthy dress she had on. "What do you gentlemen desire?" asked she. "Why, Monsieur Duveyrier," exclaimed the uncle, losing patience, "we have already told the servant. Let him know that Monsieur Auguste Vabre and Monsieur Narcisse Bachelard wish to see him." Madame Bouquet shut the door again. The eldest of the sisters was now mounted on the music-stool and was hammering with her elbows, whilst the youngest was scraping the saucepan with an iron fork so as to get all she could out of it. Another 5 minutes passed by. Then, in the midst of the uproar, which did not seem to disturb her in the least, Clarice appeared. "Ah! It's you," said she to Bachelard, without even looking at Auguste. "You know, my old fellow," added she, "if you've come to tipple, you may as well get out at once. The old life's done with. I now intend to be respected." "We haven't called on your account," replied Bachelard, recovering himself, used as he was to the lively receptions of such ladies. "We must speak to Duveyrier." Then Clarice looked at the other gentleman. She took him for a bailiff, knowing that Alphonse was already in a mess. "Oh, after all, I don't care," said she. "You can take him and keep him if you like. It's not so very pleasant to have to dress his pimples." She no longer even took the trouble to conceal her disgust, certain, moreover, that all her cruelties only attached him to her the more. And opening a door, she added, "Here, come along, as these gentlemen persist in seeing you." Duveyrier, who seemed to have been waiting behind the door, entered and shook their hands, trying to conjure up a smile. He no longer had the youthful air of bygone days, when he used to spend the evening at her rooms in the Rue de la Cérissée. He looked overcome with weariness. He was mournful and much thinner, starting at every moment, as though he were uneasy about something behind him. Clarice remained to listen. Bachelard, who did not intend to speak before her, invited the councillor to lunch. "Now, do accept. Monsieur Vabre wants you." "Madame will be kind enough to excuse." But the latter had at length caught sight of her sister hammering on the piano, and she slapped her and turned her out of the room, taking the same opportunity to cuff and drive away the little one with her saucepan. There was a most infernal uproar. The invalid aunt in the next room again started off yelling, thinking they were coming to beat her. "Do you hear, my darling?" murmured Duveyrier. "These gentlemen have invited me to lunch." But she was not listening to him. She was trying the instrument with frightened tenderness. For a month past she had been learning to play the piano. It was the secret dream of her whole life, a far-away ambition, the realization of which could alone stamp her a woman of society. Having satisfied herself that there was nothing broken, she was about to prevent her lover from going, simply to annoy him, when Madame Bouquet once more bobbed her head in at the door, again hiding her skirt. "Your music master," said she. At this, Clarisse changed her mind and called to Duveyrier. "That's it. Be off. I'll lunch with Theodore. We don't want you." After kissing her on the hair, he discreetly withdrew, leaving her with Theodore. In the anteroom, the big rascal of a brother asked him in his jocular way for a franc for tobacco. Then, as they went downstairs, Bachelard expressed surprise at his conversion to the charms of the piano, and he swore he had never disliked it. He talked of the ideal, saying how much Clarisse's simple scale stirred his soul, yielding to his continual mania for having a bright side to his coarse masculine appetites. Down below, Troublot had given the driver a cigar, and was listening to his history with the liveliest interest. The uncle insisted on lunching at Foyot's. It was the proper time, and they could talk better whilst eating. Then, when the cab had managed to start off again, he told everything to Duveyrier, who became very grave. Auguste's uneasiness seemed to have increased at Clarisse's, where he had not opened his mouth, and now, worn out by this interminable drive, his head entirely a prey to a violent aching, he abandoned himself. When the counselor questioned him as to what he intended doing, he opened his eyes and remained a moment filled with anguish. Then he repeated his former phrase, "Why, fight, of course." Only, his voice was weaker, and he added, as he closed his eyes, as though to ask to be left alone, "Unless you have anything else to suggest." Then the gentleman held a grand council in the midst of the laborious jolts of the vehicle. Duveyrier, the same as Bachelard, considered the duel indispensable, and he was deeply affected by it, on account of the blood likely to be spilt, a long black stream of which he pictured soiling the stairs of his property, but honor demanded it, and one cannot compound with honor. Troublot had broader views. It was too stupid to place one's honor in what, out of decency, he termed a woman's frailty. And Auguste approved what he said by a weary blink of his eyelids, thoroughly incensed at last by the bellicose rage of the two others, whose duty it was, on the contrary, to have been conciliatory. In spite of his fatigue, he was obliged to relate once more the scene of the night before, the blow he had given and the blow he had received, and soon the fact of the adultery was lost sight of. The discussion bore solely upon these two blows. They were commented upon and analyzed, as a satisfactory solution was sought for. "What refinement?" Troublot ended by contemptuously saying. "If they hit each other, well, they're quits." Duveyrier and Bachelard looked at one another, evidently shaken in their opinions. But just then they arrived at the restaurant, and the uncle declared that they would first of all have a good lunch. It would help to clear their ideas. He stood treat, ordering a copious meal with costly dishes and wines, which kept them 3 hours in a private room. The duel was not even once mentioned. From the very beginning, the conversation had necessarily turned on the question of women. Fifi and Clarisse were during the whole time explained, turned inside out, and pulled to pieces. Bachelard now admitted himself to have been in the wrong, so as not to appear to the counselor as having been vilely chucked over, whilst the latter, taking his revenge for the evening when the uncle had seen him weep in the middle of the empty rooms in the Rue de la Cerisaie, lied about his happiness, to the point of believing in it and being affected by it himself. Seated before them, Auguste, prevented by his neuralgia both from eating and drinking, appeared to be listening, an elbow on the table and a confused look in his eyes. At dessert, Troublot recollected the driver who had been forgotten outside, and, full of sympathy, he sent him the remnants of the dishes and what was left in the bottles. For, said he, from certain things he had let drop, he had a suspicion the man was an ex-priest. 3 o'clock struck. Duveyrier complained of being assessor at the next sitting of the assizes. Bachelard, who was now very drunk, spat sideways onto Troublot's trousers, without the latter noticing it, and the day would have been finished there, amidst the liquors, if Auguste had not suddenly roused himself with a start. "Well, what's going to be done?" asked he. "Well, young un," replied the uncle, speaking most familiarly, "if you like, we'll settle matters nicely for you." It's stupid to fight." No one appeared surprised at this conclusion. Duveyrier signified his approval with a nod of the head. The uncle continued, "I'll go with Monsieur Duveyrier and see the fellow, and he shall apologize, or my name isn't Bachelard. The mere sight of me will make him cave in, just because I shall have no business there. I don't care a hang for anyone." Auguste shook him by the hand, but he did not seem to feel relieved. The pain in his head had become so unbearable. At length they left the private room. Down in the street the driver was still at lunch, inside the cab, and, completely intoxicated, he had to shake the crumbs out, digging Troublot fraternally in the stomach. Only the horse, which had had nothing at all, refused to walk, with a despairing wag of the head. They pushed him, and he ended by going down the Rue de Tournon as though he were rolling along. 4 o'clock had struck when the animal at length stopped in the Rue de Choiseul. Auguste had had the cab 7 hours. Troublot, who remained inside, engaged it for himself and declared that he would wait there for Bachelard, whom he wished to invite to dinner. "Well, you have been a time," said Théophile to his brother as he hastened to meet him. "I thought you were dead." And directly the gentleman had entered the warehouse, he related how the day had passed. He had been watching the house ever since 9 o'clock, but nothing particular had occurred. At 2 o'clock Valerie had gone to the Tuileries Gardens with their son Camille. Then, toward 3:30, he had seen Octave go out. And that was all. Nothing moved, not even at the Josserans. Saturnin, who had been seeking his sister under the furniture, having gone up to ask for her, Madame Josserand had shut the door in his face, doubtless to get rid of him, saying that Berthe was not there. Since then, the madman had been prowling about with clenched teeth. "Very well," said Bachelard, "we'll wait for the gentleman. We shall see him come in from here." Auguste, whose head was in a whirl, was making great efforts to keep on his legs. Then Duveyrier advised him to go to bed. There was no other cure for headache. "Go up now, we no longer require you. We will inform you of the result. My dear fellow, you know you should avoid all emotions." And the husband went up to lie down. At 5 o'clock the 2 others were still waiting for Octave. The latter, without any definite object, simply desirous of having some fresh air and of forgetting the events of the night, had at first passed before the Ladies' Paradise, where he had stopped to wish Madame Hédouin good day as she stood in the doorway, dressed in deep mourning, and as he informed her of his having left the Webers, she had quietly asked him why he did not return to her. Opposite to him, Valerie was taking leave of a bearded gentleman at the door of a low lodging-house in the darkest corner. She blushed and hastened away, pushing open the padded door of the church. Then, seeing that the young man was following her and smiling, she preferred to await him under the porch, where they conversed together very cordially. "You run away from me," said he. "Are you, then, angry with me?" "Angry?" repeated she. "Why should I be angry?" "Ah, they may quarrel and eat each other up if they like. It doesn't matter to me." She was speaking of her relations, and she at once gave vent to her old rancor against Bertha, making at first simply allusions so as to sound the young man. Then, when she felt he was secretly weary of his mistress, being still exasperated with the night's proceedings, she no longer restrained herself, but poured out her heart. To think that that woman had accused her of selling herself, she who never accepted a sou, not even a present. Yes, though, a few flowers at times, some bunches of violets. And now everybody knew which of the two was the one to sell herself. She had prophesied that one day it would be known how much she could be bought for. "It cost you more than a bunch of violets, did it not?" asked she. "Yes, yes," murmured he basely. In his turn, he let out some disagreeable things about Bertha, saying that she was spiteful, and even making her out to be too fat, as though seeking to avenge himself for the worry she was causing him. He had been waiting all day for her husband's seconds, and he was then returning home to see if anyone had called. It was a most stupid adventure. She might very well have prevented this duel taking place. He ended by relating all that had occurred at their ridiculous meeting, their quarrel, then Augusta's arrival on the scene, before they had even exchanged a caress. "On all I hold most sacred," said he, "I had not even touched her." Valerie laughed and was getting quite excited. She gradually yielded to the tender intimacy of this exchange of confidences, drawing nearer to Octave as though to some female friend who knew all. At times, a devotee coming from the church disturbed them, then the door generally closed to again, and they once more found themselves alone in the drum, hung with green baize, as though in the innermost recesses of some discreet and religious asylum. "I scarcely know why I live with such people," resumed she, returning to the subject of her relations. "Oh, no doubt I am not free from reproach on my side. But frankly, I cannot feel any remorse, they affect me so little, and yet if I were to tell you how much love bores me—" "Come now, not so much as all that," said Octave gaily. "People are not always as silly as we were yesterday. There are blissful moments." Then she confessed herself. It was not entirely the hatred she felt for her husband, the continual fever which shook his frame, his impotence, nor yet his perpetual blubbering like a little boy which had caused her to misbehave herself 6 months after her marriage. No, she often did it involuntarily, solely because her head got filled with things of which she was unable to explain the why and the wherefore. Everything gave way. She became quite ill and could almost kill herself. Then, as there was nothing to restrain her, she might as well take that leap as another. "But really now, do you never have a nice time of it?" again asked Octave. "Well, never like people describe," replied she. He looked at her full of a pitying sympathy. "All for nothing and without the least pleasure. It was certainly not worth the trouble she gave herself in her continual fear of being caught." And he especially felt a certain relief to his pride, for he had always suffered a little at heart from her old disdain. He recalled the circumstance to her. "You remember after one of your attacks?" "Oh, yes, I remember. Still, I did not dislike you. But listen, it is far better as it is. We should be detesting each other now." She gave him her little gloved hand. He squeezed it as he repeated, "You are right. It is better as it is. Really, one only cares for the women one has had nothing to do with." It was quite a blissful moment. They stood for a while, hand in hand, deeply affected. Then, without another word, they pushed open the padded door of the church, inside which she had left her son Camille in care of the woman who let out the chairs. The child had fallen asleep. She made him kneel down and did the same herself for a minute, burying her face in her hands as though in the midst of a fervent prayer. And she was rising to her feet when Abbé Maudouet, who was coming from a confessional, greeted her with a paternal smile. Octave had simply passed through the church. When he returned home, every one was on the alert. In the doorway, as Octave passed, Lisa, who was gossiping with Adele, had to content herself with merely staring at him, and both resumed their complaints of the dear price of poultry beneath the stern look of Monsieur Gourde, who bowed to the young man. As the latter was going up to his room, Madame Jusser, who had been on the watch ever since the morning, slightly opened her door and, seizing hold of his hands, drew him into her anteroom, where she kissed him on the forehead and murmured, "Poor child. There, I won't keep you. Come back and talk with me when it's all over." And he had scarcely reached his own apartment when Duveyrier and Bachelard called. At first, amazed at seeing the uncle, he wished to give them the names of 2 of his friends. But these gentlemen, without answering, spoke of their age and preached him a sermon on his misconduct. Then, as in the course of conversation he announced his intention of leaving the house at the earliest possible moment, they both solemnly declared that that proof of his discretion was quite sufficient. There had been more than enough scandal. The time had come when respectable people had the right to expect them to make the sacrifice of their passions. Duveyrier accepted Octave's notice to quit on the spot, and withdrew, whilst, behind his back, Bachelard invited the young man to dine with him that evening. "Mind, I count upon you." "We're on the spree. Troublot is waiting below. I don't care a button for Eleanor, but I don't wish to see her, and I'll go down first so that no one shall meet us together." He took his departure, and 5 minutes later, Octave, delighted with the issue of affairs, joined him below. He slipped into the cab, and the melancholy horse, which had been dragging the husband about for 7 hours, limped along with them to a restaurant near the Halles, where some marvelous tripe was to be obtained. Duveyrier had gone back to Théophile in the warehouse. Valerie also had just come in, and all three were talking together when Clotilde herself returned from a concert. She had gone there, moreover, with a mind perfectly at ease, certain, said she, that some arrangement satisfactory to everyone would be arrived at. Then ensued a pause, a momentary embarrassment between the two families. Théophile, seized with an abominable fit of coughing, was almost spitting his teeth out. As it was to their mutual interest to be reconciled, they ended by taking advantage of the emotion into which the new family troubles had plunged them. The two women embraced. Duveyrier swore to Théophile that the Vabray inheritance was ruining him, yet he promised to indemnify him by remitting his rent for 3 years. "I must go and tranquilize poor Auguste," at length observed the counsellor. He was ascending the stairs when some terrible cries, resembling those of an animal being butchered, issued from the bedroom. It was Saturnin who, armed with his kitchen knife, had noiselessly crept as far as the alcove, and there, his eyes as red as flaming coals, his mouth covered with foam, he had rushed upon Auguste. "Tell me, where have you put her?" cried he. "Give her back to me, or I'll bleed you like a pig." The husband, suddenly roused from his painful slumber, tried to fly. But the madman, with the strength of his fixed idea, had caught him by the tail of his shirt and, pushing him back on the mattress, placing his neck on the edge of the bed, over a basin which happened to be there, he held him in the position of an animal at the slaughterhouse. "Ah, it's all right this time. I'm going to bleed you. I'm going to bleed you like a pig." Fortunately, the others arrived and were able to release the victim. But Saturnin, who was raving mad, had to be shut up, and 2 hours later, the commissary of police having been sent for, he was taken for the second time to the Asile des Moulineaux with the consent of the family. Poor Auguste lay trembling. He said to Duveyrier, who informed him of the arrangement that had been come to with Octave, "No, I should have preferred to have fought the duel. One cannot defend oneself against a madman. Why has he such a mania for wishing to bleed me, the brigand?" "Because his sister has made a cuckold of me." "Ah, I've had enough of it, my friend. I've had enough of it, on my word of honor." Chapter 16. On the Wednesday morning, when Marie brought birth to Madame Josserand, the latter, bursting with anger at the thought of an adventure which she felt was a sad blow to her pride, became quite pale and unable to utter a word. She caught hold of her daughter's hand with the roughness of a teacher dragging a refractory scholar to the black hole, and, leading her to Hortense's room, she pushed her inside, saying at length, "Heed yourself. Never show yourself again." "You will kill your father if you do."
What's up? Whatever have you done?
asked her sister, whose astonishment increased on seeing her wrapped in an old shawl which Marie had lent her. "Has poor Auguste fallen ill at Lyons?" But Berthe would not answer. No. Later on, there were things she could not speak about, and she beseeched Hortense to go away, to let her have the room to herself, so that she could at least weep there in peace. The day passed thus. Monsieur Josserand had gone off to his office without having the faintest idea of what had occurred. Then, when he returned home in the evening, Berthe still remained in hiding. As she had refused all food, she ended by ravenously devouring the little dinner which Adèle brought to her in secret. The maid remained watching her and, in presence of her appetite, said, "Don't worry yourself so much. Pick up your strength. The house is quite quiet. And as for anyone being killed or wounded, there's nobody hurt at all." Ah, said the young woman. She questioned Adele, who gave her a long account of how the day had passed, the duel which had not come off, what Monsieur Auguste had said, and what the Duverrys and the Vabrets had done. She listened to her, and seemed to live again, gobbling everything up and asking for more bread. In all truth, it was foolish of her to take the matter so much to heart when the others seemed to be already consoled.
So you won't tell me?
Asked Hortense again. But, my darling, answered Bertha, you're not married. I really can't. It's a quarrel I've had with Auguste. He came back, you know. And as she interrupted herself, her sister resumed impatiently, Get along with you, what a fuss! Good heavens, at my age I'm quite old enough to know. Then Bertha confessed herself, at first choosing her words, then letting out everything, talking of Octave and talking of Auguste. Hortense listened as she lay on her back in the dark, and merely uttered a few words to question her sister or to give an opinion. What did he say to you then? And you? How did you feel? Well, that's funny. I shouldn't like that. Ah, really? So that's the way. Midnight, 1 o'clock, then 2 struck. Still they went on with the story, their limbs little by little irritated by the sheets, and themselves gradually becoming drowsy. Oh, as for me, with Verdier, it will be very simple, declared Hortense abruptly. I shall do just as he wishes. At the mention of Verdier's name, Bertha gave a movement of surprise. She thought the marriage was broken off, for the woman with whom he had been living for 15 years past had just had a child at the very moment that he intended leaving her. Do you then expect to marry him all the same? Asked she. Well, land, why not? I was stupid enough to wait too long, but the child will die. It's a girl and all scrofulous. Poor woman! Bertha was unable to help exclaiming. How, poor woman? Cried Hortense sourly. It's easy to see that you also have things to reproach yourself with. She at once regretted her cruelty and, taking her sister in her arms, kissed her and swore that she did not mean it. Then they were silent. But still they could not sleep, so continued the story, their eyes wide open in the darkness. The next morning, Monsieur Josserand did not feel very well. Up to 2 o'clock he had persisted in addressing rappers, in spite of a lowness of spirits and of a gradual loss of strength of which he had been complaining for some time. He got up, however, and dressed himself, but when he was on the point of starting for his office, he felt so feeble that he sent a messenger with a letter to inform the brothers Bernheim of his indisposition. The family were about to have their breakfast. On seeing her husband remain, Madame Josserand decided not to hide Bertha any longer. She was already sick of all the mystery, and was, moreover, expecting every minute to see Auguste come up and create a disturbance. What? You're going to breakfast with us? Whatever is the matter? Asked the father in great surprise on beholding his daughter, her eyes heavy with sleep, her bosom half bursting through Hortense's too-tight dressing-gown. My husband has written to say that he is obliged to stay at Lyons, answered she, so I thought of spending the day with you. Is it really true? You are not hiding anything from me, murmured he. What an idea! Why should I hide anything from you? Madame Josserand merely allowed herself to shrug her shoulders. What was the use of all those precautions? To gain an hour, perhaps, it was not worth while. The father would always have to receive the blow in the end. The breakfast, however, passed off most pleasantly, but a regrettable scene spoilt the end of the breakfast. All on a sudden, Madame Josserand addressed the servant. Whatever are you eating? For some little while past she had been watching her. Adele, dragging her shoes after her, turned clumsily round the table. Nothing, madame, replied she. How? Nothing. You're chewing. I'm not blind. See, you've got your mouth full of it. Oh, it's no use drawing in your cheeks. It's easy to see in spite of that. And you've got some in your pocket, haven't you? Adele became confused and tried to draw back. but Madame Josserand caught hold of her by the skirt. "For a quarter of an hour past, I've been watching you take something out of there and thrust it under your nose after hiding it in your hand. It must be something very good." "Let me see what it is." She dived into the pocket in her turn and withdrew a handful of cooked prunes. The juice was still trickling from them. "What is this?" cried she furiously. "Prunes, madam," said the servant, who, seeing herself caught, became insolent. "Ah, you eat my prunes. So that's why they go so quickly and never again appear on the table. I could never have believed it possible. Prunes in a pocket." And she also accused her of drinking her vinegar. Everything disappeared. One could not even have a potato about without being certain of never seeing it again. "You're a regular gulf, my girl. Give me sufficient to eat," retorted Adele boldly, "and then I won't touch your potatoes." This was too much. Madame Josserand rose from her seat, majestic and terrible. "Hold your tongue and don't answer me. Oh, I know, it's the other servants who've spoilt you. Directly a simpleton arrives in a house from the country, all the hussies in the place at once put her up to all sorts of horrors. You no longer go to mass, and now you steal." Adele, who had indeed been worked up by Lisa and Julie, did not yield. "When I was a simpleton, as you say, you should not have taken advantage of me. It's ended now." "Leave the room, I discharge you," cried Madame Josserand, pointing to the door with a tragical gesture. She sat down quite shaken, whilst the maid, without hurrying herself, dragged her shoes after her, and swallowed another prune before returning to the kitchen. The breakfast, however, finished in the most affectionate intimacy. Monsieur Josserand, deeply moved, spoke of poor Saturnin, who had had to be taken away the day before during his absence from home, and, as he believed, in a sudden fit of raving madness with which his son had been seized in the middle of the shop, for such was the story that had been told him. "How is the marriage getting on?" asked Monsieur Josserand discreetly. At first the mother replied in well-chosen phrases, "On account of Hortense." Now she was at the feet of her son, a young fellow who was sure to succeed, and she would even throw his name in the father's face at times, saying that, thank goodness, he took after her, and would never leave his wife without a pair of shoes. She little by little warmed with her subject. In short, he's had enough of it. It was all very well for a while, and did him no harm, but if the aunt doesn't give him the niece, good night. He'll cut off all supplies. I think he is quite right." Hortense, out of decency, sipped her coffee, making a show of obliterating herself behind the cup, whilst Bertha, who for the future might hear anything, gave a slight pout of repugnance at her brother's successes. The family were about to rise from table, and Monsieur Josserand, who was more cheerful and feeling much better, was talking of going to his office all the same, when Adele brought in a card. The person was waiting in the drawing-room. "What? It's her! And at this hour of the morning!" exclaimed Madame Josserand. "And I who haven't got my stays on. So much the worse. It's time I gave her a piece of my mind." The visitor was Madame d'Ambreville. The father and his two daughters remained talking in the dining-room, whilst the mother directed her steps to the drawing-room. But she stopped at the door before opening it, and anxiously examined her old green silk dress, trying to button it up, picking off the threads gathered from the floors, and driving in her immense bosom with a tap. "Excuse me, dear madam," said the visitor with a smile. "I was passing, so could not resist calling to see how you were." She was all laced up, and had her hair done in the most correct style, while she conversed in the easy way of an amiable woman who had just come up to wish a friend good day. Only her smile trembled, and behind her society graces one could detect a frightful anguish with which her whole frame quivered. She at first talked of all sorts of things, avoiding any mention of Léon's name, but at length she took from her pocket a letter which she had just received from him. "Oh, such a letter, such a letter!" murmured she in an altered voice, half broken with sobs. Whatever is it he has to complain of, dear madame? He says he will never come to our house again, and her feverish hand held out the letter, which quite shook as she offered it to Madame Josserand. The latter read it coldly. It was a breaking off of the acquaintance in 3 lines of most cruel conciseness. "Really," said she as she returned the letter, "Léon is not perhaps altogether wrong." But Madame d'Amberville at once began to praise up the widow. A woman scarcely 35 years old, most accomplished and sufficiently rich, who would make a minister of her husband, she was so active. In short, she had kept her promises, she had found a fine match for Léon, whatever had he to be angry about? And, without waiting for a reply, making up her mind with a nervous start, she named Raymond her niece. Really now, was it possible? A chit of 16, a young savage who knew nothing of life? Why not? Madame Josserand kept repeating at each interrogation. Why not, if he loves her? No, no, he did not love her. He could not love her. Madame d'Amberville struggled and gradually abandoned herself. "Come," cried she, "I only ask him for a little gratitude. It's I who have made him. It's thanks to me that he is an auditor, and he will receive a higher appointment on his wedding day. Madame, I implore you, tell him to return to me. Tell him to do me that pleasure. I appeal to his heart, to your motherly heart, yes, to all that is noble in your nature." She clasped her hands. Her words became inarticulate. A pause ensued, during which they were standing face to face. Then suddenly she burst out into the most bitter sobs, vanquished and no longer mistress of herself. "Not with Raymond," stuttered she. "Oh!" "No, not with Raymond. Keep quiet, my dear, you make me quite ashamed," replied Madame Josserand angrily. "I have daughters who might hear you. I know nothing, and I don't wish to know anything. If you have affairs with my son, you must settle them together. I will never place myself in a questionable position." Yet she loaded her with advice. At her age, one should resign oneself to the inevitable. "Just think, dear friend, he is not yet 30. I should be grieved to appear unkind, but you might be his mother. Oh, he knows what he owes you, and I myself am filled with gratitude. You will remain his guardian angel. Only, when a thing is ended, it is ended. You could not possibly have hoped to have kept him always, and as the wretched woman refused to listen to reason, wishing simply to have him back, and at once the mother grew quite angry. "Do have done, madame. It is kind on my part to be so obliging. The boy will have no more of it. It is easily to be understood. Look at yourself, pray. It is I now who would call him back to his duty, if he submitted again to your exactions, for, I ask you, what good can there be in it for both of you in future? It so happens that he is coming here, and if you have counted on me—" Of all these words, Madame d'Amberville only heard the last phrase. For a week past she had been running about after Léon, without succeeding in seeing him. Her face brightened up. She uttered this cry from her heart:
"As he is coming, I shall stay."
From that moment she made herself at home, seating herself like a heavy mass in an armchair, her eyes fixed on vacancy, declining any further questioning with the obstinacy of an animal which will not yield even when beaten. Madame Josserand, bitterly regretting having said too much, exasperated with this sort of milestone which had become a fixture in her drawing-room, yet not daring to turn her out, ended by leaving her to herself. Moreover, some sounds coming from the dining-room made her feel uneasy. She fancied she recognized Auguste's voice. "On my word of honor, madam, one never heard of such a thing before," said she, violently slamming the door. "It is most indiscreet." It was indeed Auguste who had come up to have the explanation with his wife's parents which he had been meditating since the day before. Monsieur Josserand, feeling jollier still and more inclined for a little enjoyment than for office duties, was proposing a walk to his daughters when Adele came and announced Madame Bertha's husband. It created quite a scare. The young woman turned pale. "What, your husband?" said the father. "But he was at Lyons. Ah, you were not speaking the truth." "There is some misfortune. For 2 days past I have seemed to feel it." And as she rose from her seat, he detained her. "Tell me, have you been quarreling again? About money, is it not, eh? Perhaps because of the dowry, of the 10,000 francs we have not paid him?" "Yes, yes, that's it," stammered Bertha, who released herself and fled. Hortense also had risen. She ran after her sister, and both took refuge in her room. Come in, my dear Auguste," said he in a choking tone of voice. "Bertha has just told me of your quarrel. I'm not very well, and they've been spoiling me. I regret immensely not being able to give you that money. I did wrong in promising, I know." "Yes, sir, I know all. You completely took me in with your lies. I don't mind so much not having the money, but it's the hypocrisy of the thing which exasperates me. Why all that nonsense about an assurance which did not exist? Why give yourself such airs of tenderness and affection by offering to advance sums which, according to you, you would not be entitled to receive till 3 years later? And you were not even blessed with a sou. Such behavior has only one name in every country." Monsieur Josserand opened his mouth to exclaim, "It is not I, it is them!" But he was ashamed to accuse the family. He bowed his head, thus accepting the responsibility of the disgraceful action. Auguste continued. "Moreover, everyone was against me, even that Duveyrier behaved like a rascal with his scoundrel of a notary, for I asked to have the assurance mentioned in the contract as a guarantee, and I was made to shut up. Had I insisted, though, you would have been guilty of swindling. Yes, sir, swindling." At this accusation, the father, who was very pale, rose to his feet, and he was about to answer, to offer his labor, to purchase his daughter's happiness with all of his existence that remained to him, when Madame Josserand, quite beside herself through Madame d'Ambreville's obstinacy, no longer thinking of her old green silk dress, now splitting through the heaving of her angry bosom, entered like a blast of wind. "Eh? What?" cried she. "Who talks of swindling? Is it you, sir? You would do better, sir, to go first to Père Lachaise cemetery to see if it's your father's payday." Auguste had expected this, but he was all the same horribly annoyed. She went on, with head erect and quite crushing in her audacity. "We've got them, your 10,000 francs. Yes, they're there in a drawer, but we will only give them to you when Monsieur Vabre returns to give you the others. What a family! A gambler of a father who lets us all in, and a thief of a brother-in-law who pops the inheritance into his own pocket." "Thief? Thief?" stammered Auguste, unable to contain himself any longer. "The thieves are here, madame." They both stood with heated countenances in front of each other. Monsieur Josserand, quite upset by all this wrangling, separated them. He beseeched them to be calm, and, trembling all over, he was obliged to sit down again. "Anyhow," resumed the son-in-law after a pause, "I won't have any strumpet in my house. Keep your money and keep your daughter. That is what I came up to tell you."
You are changing the subject,
quietly observed the mother. "Very well, we will discuss the fresh one." "I told you she would deceive me," cried Auguste with an air of indignant triumph. "And I answered that you were doing everything to lead to such a result," declared Madame Josserand victoriously. "Oh!" "I do not pretend that Bertha is right. What she has done is simply idiotic, and she won't lose anything by waiting. I shall let her know what I think of it. But, however, as she is not present, I can state the fact: you alone are guilty." "What? I guilty?" "Undoubtedly, my dear fellow. You don't know how to deal with women. Here's an instance. Do you even deign to come to my Tuesday receptions? No, you perhaps put in an appearance 3 times during the season, and then only stay half an hour. Though one may have headaches, one should be polite. Oh, of course, it's no great crime. Anyhow, it judges you. You don't know how to live. Her voice hissed with a slowly gathered rancor, for, on marrying her daughter, she had above all counted on her son-in-law to fill her drawing-room. And he brought no one. He did not even come himself. It was the end of one of her dreams. She would never be able to struggle against the Duverrier's choruses. However, added she, ironically, I force no one to come and amuse himself in my home. The truth is, it is not very amusing there, replied he, out of all patience. This threw her into a towering rage. That's it, insult away. Learn, sir, that I might have all the high life of Paris if I wished, and that I was not looking to you to help me to keep my rank in society. There was no longer any question of Bertha. The adultery had disappeared before this personal quarrel. Monsieur Josserand continued to listen to them, as though he were tossing about in the midst of some nightmare. It was not possible. His daughter could not have caused him this grief, and he ended by painfully rising again from his seat and going, without saying a word, in search of Bertha. Directly she was there, she would throw herself into Auguste's arms, and then everything would be explained and forgotten. He found her in the midst of a quarrel with Hortense, who was urging her to implore her husband's forgiveness, having already had enough of her, and being unwilling to share her room any longer. The young woman resisted, yet she ended by following her father. As they returned to the dining room where the breakfast cups were still scattered over the table, Madame Josserand was exclaiming, "No, on my word of honor, I don't pity you." On catching sight of Berthe, she stopped speaking and again retired into her stern majesty. When his wife appeared before him, Auguste made a gesture of protest, as though to remove her from his path. "Come," said Monsieur Josserand in his gentle and trembling voice, "what is the matter with you all? I can't make it out. You will drive me mad with all your quarreling." "Your husband is mistaken, is he not, my child? You will explain things to him. You must have a little consideration for your old parents. Embrace each other now. Come, do it for my sake." Bertha, who would all the same have kissed Auguste, stood there awkwardly and half choked by her dressing-gown on seeing him draw back with an air of tragical repugnance. "What? You refuse too, my darling," continued the father. "You should take the first step, and you, my dear boy, encourage her, be indulgent." The husband at length gave free vent to his anger. "Encourage her not if I know it. I found her in her chemise, sir, and with that man. Do you take me for a fool that you wish me to kiss her? In her chemise, sir." Monsieur Josserand stood lost in amazement. Then he caught hold of Bertha's arm. "You say nothing. Can it be true? On your knees, then." But Auguste had reached the door. He was hastening away. "Your comedies are useless. They don't take me in. Don't try to shove her on my shoulders again. I've had her once too often. You hear me? Never again. I would sooner go to law about it. Pass her on to someone else if she's in your way. And besides, you're no better than she is." He waited till he was in the ante-room, and then further relieved himself by shouting out these last words. Yes, when one makes a strumpet of one's daughter, one should not push her into a respectable man's arms. The outer door banged, and a profound silence ensued. Bertha had mechanically gone back to her seat at the table, lowering her eyes and looking at the coffee dregs in the bottom of her cup, whilst her mother sharply walked about, carried away by the tempest of her violent emotions. The father, utterly worn out, and with a face as white as that of a corpse, had sat down all by himself at the other end of the room, against the wall. An odor of rancid butter of inferior quality, purposely bought at the Halles, quite infected the apartment. Now that that vulgar person has gone, said Madame Josserand, one may be able to hear oneself speak. Ah, sir, these are the results of your incapacity. Do you at length acknowledge your errors? Think you that such quarrels would be picked with either of the brothers Bernheim, with one of the owners of the St. Joseph glass-works? Monsieur Josserand, with a lifeless look in his eyes, had not even stirred. She had stopped before him with an enraged desire for a row. Then, seeing he did not move, she continued to pace the room. Yes, yes, be disdainful. You know it will not affect me much. And we will see if you will again dare to speak ill of my relations after all that yours have done. Uncle Bachelard is quite a star. My sister is most polite. Listen, do you wish to know my opinion? Well, it is that if my father had not died, you would have killed him. As for your father... Monsieur Josserand's face became whiter than ever as he remarked, I beseech you, Eleanor, I abandon my father to you, and also all my relations. Only, I beseech you, let me be. I do not feel well. Bertha, taking pity on him, raised her head. Do leave him alone, mamma, said she. So, turning toward her daughter, Madame Josserand resumed more violently than ever. I've been keeping you for the last, you won't lose by waiting. Yes, ever since yesterday I've been bottling it up, but I warn you, I can no longer keep it in. I can no longer keep it in. With that counter-jumper, I can scarcely believe it. Have you then lost all pride? I thought that you were making use of him, that you were just sufficiently amiable to cause him to interest himself in the business downstairs, and I assisted you. I encouraged him. In short, tell me what advantage you saw in it all. None whatever, stammered the young woman. Then why did you take up with him? It was even more stupid than wicked. How absurd you are, mamma. One can never explain such things. Madame Josserand was again walking about. Ah, you can't explain. Well, but you ought to be able to. There is not the slightest shadow of sense in misbehaving oneself like that, and it is this which exasperates me. Did I ever tell you to deceive your husband? Did I ever deceive your father? He is here. Ask him. Let him say if he ever caught me with any other man. Her pace slackened and became quite majestic, and she slapped herself on her green bodice, driving her breasts back under her arms. Nothing, not a fault, not the least forgetfulness, even in thought. My life has been a chaste one. Yet God knows what I have had to put up with from your father. I have had every excuse. Many women would have avenged themselves. But I had some sense, and that saved me. Before heaven, said she, I swear I would have restrained myself, even if the Emperor had pestered me. One loses too much. She took a few steps in silence, apparently reflecting, and then added, Moreover, it is the greatest possible shame. Monsieur Josserand looked at her, looked at his daughter, and his lips moved, though no sound came from them, and his whole suffering being conjured them to put an end to this cruel explanation. But Bertha, who bent before violence, was wounded by her mother's lesson. She at length rebelled, for she was quite unconscious of her fault, thanks to the old education which she had received when a girl in search of a husband. Well, said she, boldly planting her elbows on the table, you should not have made me marry a man I did not love. Now I hate him, and I have taken another. In short, he bores me, and I bore him, declared she. It's not my fault. We don't understand one another. As early as the morrow of our wedding day, he looked as though he thought we had taken him in. Yes, he was cold and put out, just like when he has a bad day's sail. For my part, I did not amuse myself particularly with him. Really, I don't think much of marriage if it offers no more pleasure than that. And that's how it all began. So much the worse. It was bound to come. I'm not the most guilty. She left off speaking, but shortly added with an air of profound conviction, "Ah, Mamma, how well I understand you now. You remember when you told us you had had more than enough of it." Madame Josserand, standing up before her, had been listening for a minute with indignant amazement.
"Eh? I said that!"
cried she. But Bertha, warming with her subject, would not stop. "You have said so 20 times. And besides, I should have liked to have seen you in my place. Auguste is not kind like Papa. You would have been fighting together about money matters before a week had passed. He would precious soon have made you say that men are only good to be taken in."
"Eh? I said that?"
repeated the mother, quite beside herself. She advanced so menacingly toward her daughter that the father held out his hands in a suppliant gesture imploring mercy. The sounds of the two women's voices struck him to the heart unceasingly, and, at each shock, he felt the wound extend. Tears gushed from his eyes as he stammered, "Do leave off, spare me." "No, it is dreadful," resumed Madame Josserand in louder tones than ever. "This wretched creature now pretends I am the cause of her shamelessness. You will see she will soon make out that it is I who have deceived her husband. So, it's my fault, for that is what you seem to mean." "It's my fault." Bertha remained with her elbows on the table, very pale but resolute. "It's very certain that, if you had brought me up differently—" She did not finish. Her mother gave her a clout with all her might, and such a hard one that it hanged Bertha's head down onto the table cover. Her hand had been itching to give it. Ever since the day before, it had been making her fingers tingle, the same as in those far-off days when the child used to oversleep herself. "There," cried she, "that's for your education. Your husband ought to have beaten you to a jelly." The young woman did not rise, but sat there sobbing, her cheek pressed against her arm. She forgot her 24 years. This clout brought her back to the slaps of other times, to a whole past of timorous hypocrisy. All her resolution of an emancipated grown-up person melted away in the great sorrow of a little girl. But, on hearing her weep so bitterly, the father was seized with a terrible emotion. He at length got up, quite distracted, and he pushed the mother away, saying, "You wish, then, to kill me between you. Tell me, must I go on my knees to you?" Madame Josserand, having relieved her feelings, and having nothing to add, was withdrawing in a royal silence, when she found Hortense listening behind the door as she suddenly opened it. This caused a fresh outburst. "Ah, so you were listening to all this filth. The one does the most horrible things, and the other takes a delight in hearing about them. The two make the pair. But, good heavens, whoever was it that brought you up?" Hortense, without being in the least moved, entered the room. "It was not necessary to listen. One can even hear you in the kitchen. The servant is wriggling with laughter. Besides, I'm old enough to be married. There is no harm in my knowing." "Verdier, eh?" resumed the mother bitterly. "That's all the satisfaction you give me. Now, you are waiting for the death of a brat. You may wait. She's big and plump, so I've been told. It serves you right." A rush of bile gave a yellow hue to the young girl's skinny countenance, and, with clenched teeth, she replied, "Though she's big and plump, Verdier can leave her. And I will make him leave her sooner than you think, just to spite you all. Yes, I will get married without anyone else's assistance. They're far too solid, the marriages you put together." Then, as her mother was advancing toward her, she added, "Ah, you know I don't intend to be slapped. Take care." They looked each other straight in the eyes, and Madame Josserand was the first to yield, hiding her retreat beneath an air of scornful domination. But the father thought the battle was going to begin again. In the midst of his sobs he kept repeating, "I can bear it no longer. I can bear it no longer." The dining room became once more wrapped in silence. Bertha, her cheek on her arm and still heaving long, nervous sighs, was growing calmer. Hortense had quietly seated herself at the other end of the table and was buttering the remainder of a roll so as to pull herself together again. Well, butter at 22 sous could only be poison. And, as it left a stinking deposit at the bottom of the saucepans, Adele was explaining that it was not even economical when a dull thud, a distant shake of the floor, suddenly caused them to listen intently. Bertha, all anxiety, at length raised her head. "What's that?" asked she. "It's perhaps Madame and the other lady in the drawing-room," said Adele. Madame Josserand had started with surprise as she crossed the drawing-room. A woman was there all alone. "What? You again?" cried she when she had recognized Madame Breville, whom she had forgotten. The latter did not stir. The family quarrels, the noisy voices, the slamming of doors seemed to have passed over her without her having felt the least breath of them. She remained immovable, looking into vacancy, buried in a heap in her love-sick mania. But there was something at work within her. The advice of Léon's mother had upset her and was deciding her to dearly purchase a few remnants of happiness. "Come," resumed Madame Josserand roughly. "You can't, sleep here. I have had a note from my son. He is not coming." Then Madame d'Amberville spoke, her mouth all clammy from her long silence, as though she were just waking up. "I am going, pray excuse me, and tell him from me that I have reflected. I consent. Yes, I will reflect still further, and perhaps I may help him to marry that girl, as he insists upon it. But it is I who give her to him, and I wish him to ask me for her, me alone, you understand. Oh, he must come back, he must come back." Her ardent voice became quite beseeching. She added in a lower tone, in the obstinate way of a woman who, after sacrificing everything, clings to a last satisfaction. "He shall marry her, but he must live with us, otherwise nothing will be done. I would sooner lose him." And she went off. Madame Josserand was most charming again. In the anteroom she said all sorts of consoling things. She promised to send her son submissive and tender that very evening, affirming that he would be delighted to live at his aunt-in-law's. Then, when she had shut the door behind Madame d'Amberville's back, filled with a pitying tenderness, she thought, "Poor boy, what a price she will make him pay for it." But at this moment she also heard the dull thud which caused the boards to tremble. Well, what was it? Was the servant smashing all the crockery now? She hastened to the dining-room and questioned her daughters. "What is it? Is the sugar basin broken?" "No, mamma." "We don't know." She turned round, looking for Adele, when she beheld her listening at the door of the bedroom. "Whatever are you doing?" cried she. "Everything is being smashed in your kitchen, and you're there spying on your master. Yes, yes, one begins with prunes and one ends with something else. For some time past you have had a way about you which greatly displeases me. You smell of men, my girl." The servant stood looking at her with wide-open eyes. At length she interrupted her. "That's not what's the matter. I think master has fallen down in there." "Good heavens! She's right," said Bertha, turning pale. "It was just like someone falling." They entered the room. Monsieur Josserand, seized with a fainting fit, was lying on the floor before the bed. His head had come in contact with a chair, and a little stream of blood was issuing from the right ear. The mother, the two daughters, and the servant surrounded and examined him. Bertha, alone, wept, again seized with the bitter sobs which the blow had called forth. And when the four of them raised him to place him on the bed, they heard him murmur, "It's all over. They've killed me." Chapter 17. Months passed by, and spring had come again. At the house in the Rue de Choiseul, everyone was talking of the approaching marriage of Octave and Madame Hédouin. Matters, however, were not so far advanced. Octave was again in his old place at the Ladies' Paradise, the business of which developed daily. Since her husband's death, Madame Hédouin was unable to attend properly to the incessantly growing concern by herself. Her uncle, old Deleuze, nailed to his easy-chair by rheumatism, troubled himself about nothing, and, naturally, the young man, who was very active and a constant prey to the mania for doing business on a large scale, had in a little while reached a position of decisive importance in the house. From this moment, their relations became most intimate. They would shut themselves for hours together in the small room right at the back. In former days, when he had sworn to himself to seduce her, he had pursued certain tactics there, trying to take advantage of her commercial emotions, whispering figures close to her neck, watching for the days of heavy takings to profit by her enthusiasm. Now he was simply good-natured, having no other aim but to push the business. He no longer even desired her, though he retained the recollection of her gentle quiver when waltzing with him on Bertha's wedding night. Perhaps she had loved. In any case, it was best to remain as they were, for, as she justly said, the business demanded a great amount of order, and it would be impolitic to wish for things which would disturb them from morning till night. Seated together at the narrow desk, they would often forget themselves after going through the books and settling the orders. He would then return to his dreams of enlargement. He had sounded the owner of the next house and had found him willing to sell. They would give notice to the second-hand dealer and to the umbrella man, and then establish a special department for silk. She, very grave, would listen, not daring to venture yet. At length, as they sat side by side one evening examining some invoices beneath the scorching flame of a gas jet, she said slowly, "I have spoken to my uncle, Monsieur Octave. He consents, so we will buy the house." "Only—" "Oh," he interrupted her joyfully to exclaim, "then the Webers are done for." She smiled and murmured reproachfully, "Do you detest them, then?" "It is not proper on your part. You are the last who should wish them ill." She had never spoken to him of his relations with Bertha. This sudden allusion embarrassed him immensely without his exactly knowing why. He blushed and tried to stammer out some explanation. "No, no, it does not concern me," resumed she, still smiling and very calm. "Excuse me, it quite escaped me. I never intended to speak to you on the subject. You are young." "So much the worse for those who are willing. Is it not so? It is the place of the husbands to guard their wives when the latter are unable to guard themselves." He experienced a sensation of relief on understanding she was not angry. He had often dreaded a coldness on her part if she came to know of his former connection. "You interrupted me, Monsieur Octave," resumed she gravely. "I was about to add that if I purchase the next house, and thus double the importance of my business, it will be impossible for me to remain single. I shall be obliged to marry again." Octave sat lost in astonishment. "What?" She already had a husband in view, and he was in ignorance of it. He at once felt that his position there was compromised. "My uncle," continued she, "told me so himself. Oh, there is no hurry just yet. I have only been 8 months in mourning. I shall wait till the autumn. Only, in trade, one must put one's heart on one's side and consider the necessities of the situation. A man is absolutely necessary here." She discussed all this calmly, like a matter of business, and he gazed on her regular and healthy beauty, on her pure complexion beneath her neatly arranged black hair. Then he regretted not having, since her widowhood, renewed the effort to become her lover. "It is always a very serious matter," stammered he. "It requires reflection." No doubt she was quite of that opinion. And she spoke of her age. "I am already old. I am 5 years older than you, Monsieur Octave." Deeply agitated, yet thinking he understood, he interrupted her, and seizing hold of her hands, he repeated, "Oh, madam." "Oh, madam." But she rose from her seat and released herself. Then she turned down the gas. "No, that's enough for today. You have some very good ideas, and it is natural I should think of you to put them into execution. Only there will be a deal of worry. We must thoroughly study the project. I know that at heart you are very serious. Think the matter over on your side, and I will think it over on mine. That is why I have named it to you. We can talk about it again later on." And things remained thus for weeks. The establishment continued just the same as usual. As Madame Hédouin always maintained her smiling serenity when in Octave's company, without an allusion to the slightest tender feeling, he affected on his side a similar peace of mind, and he ended by becoming like her, healthfully happy, placing his confidence in the logic of things. She often repeated that sensible things always happened of themselves. Therefore she was never in a hurry. The gossip which commenced to circulate respecting her intimacy with the young man did not in the least affect her. They waited. In the Rue de Choiseul, therefore, the entire house vowed that the marriage was as good as accomplished. Octave had given up his room to lodge in the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin, near the Ladies' Paradise. He no longer visited anyone, neither the Camperdons nor the Duveyriers, who were quite shocked at the scandal of his amours. Monsieur Gord himself, whenever he saw him, pretended not to recognize him, so as to avoid having to bow. Only Marie and Madame Jouzuer, on the mornings when they met him in the neighborhood, went and stood a moment in some doorway to have a chat with him. Madame Jouzuer, who passionately questioned him respecting Madame Hédouin, tried to persuade him to call upon her so as to be able to talk the matter over nicely, and Marie, who was greatly distressed, complaining of again being in the family way, and who told him of Jules's amazement and of her parents' terrible anger. Then, when the rumor of his marriage became more persistent, Octave was surprised to receive a low bow from Monsieur Gord. Campardon, without exactly making friends again, gave him a cordial nod across the street, whilst Duveyrier, calling one evening to buy some gloves, showed himself most amiable. The entire house was beginning to pardon him. However, the uneasiness caused by the adulterous act was still there, imperceptible to uneducated people, but most disagreeable to those of refined morals. Auguste obstinately persisted in not taking his wife back, and, so long as Bertha lived with her parents, the scandal would not be effaced. There would ever linger a material vestige of it. It was Duveyrier especially who, as landlord, carried the burden of this persistent and unmerited misfortune. For some time past Clarice had been torturing him to such a pitch that he would at times come home to his wife to weep. But the scandal of the adultery had struck him to the heart. He saw, said he, the passer-by look at his house from top to bottom. That house which his father-in-law and he had striven to decorate with every domestic virtue, and, as this sort of thing could not be allowed to last, he talked of purifying the building for his personal honor. Therefore he urged Auguste, in the name of public decency, to become reconciled with his wife. Unfortunately, Auguste resisted, backed up in his rage by Théophile and Valérie, who had definitely installed themselves at the pay-desk, and who were delighted with the existing discord. Then, as matters were going badly at Lyons, and the silk warehouse was in jeopardy for want of capital, Duveyrier conceived a practical idea. The Josserins were probably longing to get rid of their daughter. The thing to do was to offer to take her back, but only on condition that they paid the dowry of 50,000 francs. Perhaps Uncle Bachelard would yield to their entreaties and give the money. At first, Auguste violently refused to be a party to any such arrangement, even were the sum 100,000 francs. He would not think it sufficient. Then, becoming very anxious as his April payments drew near, he had given in to the councillor's arguments, as the latter pleaded the cause of morality and spoke merely of a good action to be done. When they were agreed, Clotilde selected the Abbé Mauduit for negotiator. It was a delicate matter. Only a priest could interfere in it without compromising himself. It so happened that the reverend man was deeply grieved by the deplorable catastrophes which had befallen one of the most interesting households of his parish, and he had already offered his advice, his experience, and his authority to put an end to a scandal at which the enemies of religion might take delight. However, when Clotilde spoke to him of the dowry, asking him to be the bearer of Auguste's conditions to the Josserans, he bowed his head and maintained a painful silence. "It is money due that my brother asks for," repeated she. "It is no bargain, understand. Moreover, my brother insists upon it." "It is necessary, and I will go," said the priest at length. The Josserans had been expecting the proposal for days. Valerie must have spoken of it. All the tenants were discussing the affair. Were they so hard up as to be forced to keep their daughter? Would they be able to obtain the 50,000 francs to get rid of her? Since the question had reached this point, Madame Josserand had been in a constant rage. What? After having had such trouble to marry Bertha, the dowry was again demanded. All the money worries were going to commence afresh. Never before had a mother had such a task to go through twice over. And all owing to the fault of that silly fool, whose stupidity went so far as to make her forget her duty. The house was becoming a hell upon earth. Bertha suffered a continual torture, for even her sister Hortense, furious at no longer sleeping alone, never uttered a sentence without introducing some insulting allusion into it. She was even reproached with the food she ate. When one had a husband somewhere, it was all the same very funny that one should go and share one's parents' meals, which were already too sparing. Then the young woman in despair would sob in corners, accusing herself of being a coward, but unable to pick up sufficient courage to go downstairs and throw herself at Auguste's feet and say, "Here, beat me. I cannot be more unhappy than I am." Monsieur Josserand alone showed some affection for his child. But that child's faults and tears were killing him. He was dying through the cruelties of the family, with an unlimited holiday from business, spent mostly in bed. Dr. Jurat, who attended him, talked of a decomposition of the blood. It was a dissolution of the entire system, during which each organ was attacked one after the other. "When you have made your father die of grief, perhaps you will be satisfied," cried the mother. And Berthe scarcely dared enter the invalid's room. Directly the father and daughter met, they wept together and did each other a great deal of harm. At length, Madame Josserand came to a grand decision. She invited Uncle Bachelard, resolved to humiliate herself once more. She would have given the 50,000 francs out of her own pocket, if she had possessed them, so as not to have to keep that big married girl whose presence dishonored her Tuesday receptions. But she had learned some shocking things about the uncle, and if he did not do as she wished, she intended once for all to give him a bit of her mind. During dinner, Bachelard behaved in a most abominable manner. He had arrived in an advanced state of intoxication, for since he had left Fifi, he had fallen into the lowest depths of vice. "Narcissi," said Madame Josserand, "the situation is a grave one." And slowly and solemnly she explained this situation, her daughter's regrettable misfortune, the husband's revolting venality, the painful resolution she had been obliged to come to of giving the 50,000 francs so as to put a stop to the scandal which covered the family with shame. Then she severely continued, "Remember what you promised, Narcissa. On the evening of the signing of the marriage contract, you again slapped your chest and swore that Bertha might rely on her uncle's affections. Well, where is this affection? The moment has arrived to display it. Monsieur Josserand, join me in showing him his duty, if your weak state of health will allow you to do so." In spite of his great repugnance, the father murmured, out of love for his daughter, "It is true you promised, Bachelard. Come, before I leave you forever, do me the pleasure of behaving as you should." But Bertha and Hortense, in the hope of working upon the uncle's feelings, had filled his glass once too often. He was in such a fuddled condition that one could not even take advantage of him. Eh? What? Stuttered he, without having the least necessity for exaggerating his intoxication. Never promise. Don't understand. Tell me again, Eleanor. The latter recommenced her story, made weeping Bertha embrace him, besought him for the sake of her husband's health, and proved to him that in giving the 50,000 francs he would be fulfilling a sacred duty. Then, as he began to doze off again, without appearing to be in the least affected by the sight of the invalid or of the chamber of sickness, she abruptly broke out into the most violent language. Listen, Narcissi, this sort of thing has been lasting too long. You're a scoundrel. I know of all your beastly goings-on. You've just married your mistress to Guélin, and you've given them 50,000 francs, the very amount you promised us. Ah, it's decent. Little Guélin plays a pretty part in it all. And you're worse still. You take the bread from our mouth. You prostitute your fortune, yes. You prostitute it by robbing us of money which was ours for the sake of that harlot. Never before had she relieved her feelings to such an extent. Hortense busied herself with her father's medicine so as not to show her embarrassment. Monsieur Josserand, who was made far worse by this scene, tossed about on his pillow and murmured in a trembling voice, "I beseech you, Eleanor, do be quiet. He will give nothing. If you wish to say such things to him, take him away that I may not hear you." Bertha, on her side, sobbed louder than ever and joined her father in his entreaties. "Enough, mamma. Do as papa asks. Good heavens, how miserable I am to be the cause of all these quarrels. I would sooner leave you all and go and die somewhere." Then Madame Josserand deliberately put the question to the uncle. "Will you, yes or no, give the 50,000 francs so that your niece may hold her head up?" Regularly scared, he tried to go into explanations. "Listen a moment. I found Guélin and Fifi together." "What could I do? I was obliged to marry them. It wasn't my fault." "Will you, yes or no, give the dowry you promised?" repeated she furiously. He wavered. His intoxication increased to such a pitch that he could scarcely find words to utter. "Can't! Word of honor!" Completely ruined. "Otherwise, at once. Candidly, you know." She interrupted him with a terrible gesture and declared, "Good, then I shall call a family council and have you declared incapable of managing your affairs. When uncles become driveling, it's time to send them to an asylum." At this, the uncle was seized with intense emotion. He glanced about him and found the room had a sinister aspect with its feeble light. He looked at the dying man who, held up by his daughters, was swallowing a spoonful of some black liquid, and his heart overflowed. He sobbed as he accused his sister of never having understood him. Yet he had already been made unhappy enough by Guélin's treachery. They knew he was very sensitive, and they did wrong to invite him to dinner, to make him sad afterward. In short, in place of the 50,000 francs, he offered all the blood in his veins. Madame Josserand, who was quite worn out, had decided to leave him to himself when the servant announced Dr. Juirat and the Abbé Maudouit. They had met on the landing and entered together. The doctor found Monsieur Josserand much worse. He was still suffering from the shock occasioned by the scene in which he had been forced to play a part. When, on his side, the priest wished to take Madame Josserand into the drawing-room, having, he said, a communication to make to her, the latter guessed on what subject he had called, and answered majestically that she was with her family and prepared to hear everything there. The doctor himself would not be in the way, for a physician was also a confessor. "Madame," then said the priest, with slightly embarrassed gentleness, "you behold in the step I am taking an ardent desire to reconcile two families. Oh." "My dear Abbé Maudouit, allow me to interrupt you," said Madame Josserand. "We are deeply moved by your efforts. But never, you understand me, never will we traffic in our daughter's honor. People who have already become reconciled over this child's back Oh, I know all. They were at daggers drawn, and now they are inseparable, reviling us from morning till night. No, such a bargain would be a disgrace. It seems to me, though, madame, ventured the priest. But she drowned his voice as she superbly continued, "See, my brother is here. You can question him." He was again saying to me only a little while ago, "Here are the 50,000 francs, Eleanor. Settle this miserable matter." Well, ask him what reply I made. Get up, Narcisse. Tell the truth. The uncle had already again fallen asleep in an armchair at the end of the room. He moved and uttered a few disconnected words. Then, as his sister insisted, he placed his hand on his heart and stammered, "When duty speaks, one must obey. The family comes before everything." "You'll hear him," cried Madame Josserand with a triumphant air. "No money, it's disgraceful. Tell those people from us that we don't die to avoid having to pay. The dowry is here. We would have given it, but now that it's exacted as the price of our daughter, the matter becomes too disgusting. Let Auguste take Bertha back first, and then we will see later on." She had raised her voice, and the doctor, who was examining his patient, was obliged to make her leave off. "Speak lower, madame," said he. "Your husband suffers." Then the Abbé Maudoui, whose embarrassment had increased, went up to the bedside and found some kind words to say. And he afterward withdrew, without again referring to the matter, hiding the confusion of having failed beneath his amiable smile, with a curl of grief and disgust on his lips. As the doctor went off in his turn, he roughly informed Madame Josserand that there was no hope for the invalid. The greatest precautions must be taken, for the least emotion might carry him off. She was thunderstruck, and returned to the dining-room, where her two daughters and their uncle had already withdrawn, to let Monsieur Josserand rest, as he seemed disposed to go to sleep. "Berthe," murmured she, "you have killed your father." "The doctor has just said so." And they all three, seated round the table, gave way to their grief, whilst Uncle Bachelard, also in tears, mixed himself a glass of grog. When Auguste learned the Josserand's answer, his rage against his wife knew no bounds, and he swore he would kick her away the day she came to ask for forgiveness. Yet in reality he wanted her. There was a voidness in his life. He seemed to be out of his element, amidst the new worries of his abandonment, quite as grave as those of his married life. Besides all this, another more serious anxiety bothered him. The lady's paradise was prospering, and already menaced his business, which decreased daily. He certainly did not regret that miserable Octave, yet he was just, and recognized that the fellow possessed very great abilities. How swimmingly everything would have gone had they only got on better together. He was seized with the most tender regrets. There were hours when, sick of his loneliness, feeling life giving way beneath him, he felt inclined to go up to the Josserands and ask them to give Bertha back to him for nothing. Duveyrier, too, moreover, did not yield, and more cut up by the moral disfavor into which such an affair threw his building, he was forever urging his brother-in-law to a reconciliation. Each day life became more and more cruel for Duveyrier at this mistress, where he encountered all the worries of his own home again, but this time in the midst of a regular hell. The whole tribe of hawkers, the mother, the big blackguard of a brother, the two little sisters, even the invalid aunt, impudently robbed him, lived on him openly, to the point of emptying his pockets during the nights he slept there. His position was also becoming a serious one in another respect. He had got to the end of his money. He trembled at the thought of being compromised on his judicial bench. He could certainly not be removed, only the young barristers were beginning to look at him in a saucy kind of way, which made it awkward for him to administer justice. And when driven away by the filth and the uproar, seized with disgust of himself, he flew from the Rue d'Assas and sought refuge in the Rue de Choiseul. His wife's malignant coldness completed the crushing of him. Then he would lose his head. He would look at the Seine on his way to the court, with thoughts of jumping in some evening when a final suffering should impart to him the requisite courage. Clotilde had noticed her husband's emotion, and felt anxious and irritated with that mistress of his who did not even make a man happy in his misconduct. But, for her part, she was greatly annoyed by a most deplorable adventure, the consequences of which quite revolutionized the house. On going upstairs one morning for a handkerchief, Clémence had caught Hippolyte with Louise, and since then she had taken to slapping him in the kitchen for the least thing, which of course greatly interfered with the attendance. The worst was that Madame could no longer close her eyes to the illicit connection existing between her maid and her footman. The other servants laughed. The scandal was reported amongst the tradespeople. It was absolutely necessary to oblige them to get married if she wished to retain them. And, as she continued to be very well satisfied with Clément, she thought of nothing but this marriage. To negotiate between lovers who were forever fighting with each other seemed such a delicate affair that she decided on employing the Abbé Mauduit, whose moralizing character seemed specially suited to the occasion. Her servants, moreover, had been causing her a great deal of trouble for some time past. When down in the country she had noticed the intimacy of her big hobbledehoy Gustave with Julie, she had at one moment thought of sending the latter about her business, though regretfully, for she liked her cooking. Then, after sound reflection, she had decided to keep her, preferring that the youngster should have a mistress at home, a clean girl who would never be any trouble. There is no knowing what a youth may get hold of outside when he begins too young. She was watching them, therefore, without saying a word, and now the other two must needs worry her with their affair. It so happened that, one morning, as Madame de Verrières was preparing to call on the priest, Clémence came, and announced that the Abbé Mauduit was taking the extreme unction up to Monsieur Josserand. After meeting him on the staircase, the maid had returned to the kitchen, exclaiming, "I said that he would come again this year." And, alluding to the catastrophes which had befallen the house, she added, "It has brought ill luck to everyone." This time the priest did not arrive too late, and that was an excellent sign for the future. Madame de Verrières hastened to Saint-Roch, where she awaited the Abbé Mauduit's return. He listened to her, and for a while maintained a sad silence. Then he was unable to refuse to enlighten the maid and the footman on the immorality of their position. Moreover, the other matter would have obliged him to return shortly to the Rue de Choiseul, for poor Monsieur Josserand would certainly not last through the night, and he mentioned that he saw in this circumstance a cruel but happy opportunity for reconciling Auguste and Berthet. He would try and arrange the two affairs simultaneously. It was high time that heaven consented to bless their efforts. "I have prayed, madame," said the priest. "The Almighty will triumph." And indeed, that evening at 7 o'clock, Monsieur Josserand's death agony began. The entire family was there, excepting Uncle Bachelard, who had been sought for in vain in all the cafes, and Saturnin, who was still confined at the Asile des Moulineaux. Léon, whose marriage was most unfortunately postponed through his father's illness, displayed a dignified grief. Madame Josserand and Hortense showed some courage. Berthe alone sobbed so loudly that, so as not to affect the invalid, she had gone and stowed herself away in the kitchen, where Adèle, taking advantage of the general confusion, was drinking some mulled wine. Monsieur Josserand expired in the quietest fashion. It was his honesty which finished him. He had passed a useless life, and he went off like a worthy man tired of the wicked things of the world, heart broken by the quiet indifference of the only beings he had ever loved. At 8 o'clock he stammered out Saturnin's name, turned his face to the wall, and expired. No one thought him dead, for all had dreaded a terrible agony. They sat patiently for some time, letting him, as they thought, sleep. When they found he was already becoming cold, Madame Josserand, in the midst of the general wailing, flew into a passion with Hortense, whom she had instructed to fetch Auguste, counting on restoring Berthe to the latter's arms amidst the great grief of her husband's last moments. "You think of nothing," said she, wiping her eyes. "But, mamma," replied the girl in tears, "no one thought Papa would go off so suddenly. You told me not to go for Auguste till 9 o'clock, so as to be sure of keeping him till the end." The sorely afflicted family found some distraction in this quarrel. It was another matter gone wrong. They never succeeded in anything. Fortunately, there was still the funeral to take advantage of to bring the husband and wife together. The funeral was a pretty decent one, though it was not so grand as Monsieur Vabre's. Moreover, it did not give rise to nearly the same excitement in the house and the neighborhood, for the deceased was not a landlord. He was merely a quiet-going body, whose demise did not even disturb Madame Juseur's slumbers. Madame Josserand and her daughters had to be supported to their coach. Léon, assisted by Uncle Bachelard, was most attentive, whilst Auguste followed behind in an embarrassed way. He got into another coach with Duvarier and Théophile. Clotilde detained the Abbé Mauduit, who had not officiated, but who had gone to the cemetery, wishing to give the family a proof of his sympathy. The horses started on the homeward journey more gaily, and she at once asked the priest to return to the house with them, for she felt that the time was favorable. He consented. The 3 mourning coaches silently drew up in the Rue de Choiseul with the relations. Théophile at once rejoined Valerie, who had remained behind to superintend a general cleaning, the warehouse being closed. "You may pack up," cried he furiously. "They're all at him. I bet he'll end by begging her pardon." They all, indeed, felt a pressing necessity for putting an end to the unpleasantness. Misfortune should at least be good for something. Auguste, in the midst of them, understood very well what they wanted, and he was alone, without strength to resist and filled with shame. The relations slowly walked in under the porch hung with black. No one spoke. On the stairs the silence continued, a silence full of deep thought, whilst the crepe skirts, soft and sad, ascended higher and higher. Auguste, seized with a final feeling of revolt, had taken the lead, with the intention of quickly shutting himself up in his own apartments, but as he opened the door, Clotilde and the priest, who had followed close behind, stopped him. Directly after them, Bertha, dressed in deep mourning, appeared on the landing, accompanied by her mother and her sister. They all 3 had red eyes. Madame Josserand, especially, was quite painful to behold. "Come, my friend," simply said the priest, overcome by tears. And that was sufficient. Auguste gave in at once, seeing that it was better to make his peace at that honorable opportunity. His wife wept, and he wept also as he stammered, "Come in. We would try not to do it again." Then the relations kissed all around. Clotilde congratulated her brother. She had had full confidence in his heart. Madame Josserand showed a broken-hearted satisfaction, like a widow who is no longer the least affected by the most unhoped-for happiness. She associated her poor husband with the general joy. "You are doing your duty, my dear son-in-law. He who is now in heaven thanks you." "Come in," repeated Auguste, quite upset. But Rachel, attracted by the noise, now appeared in the anteroom, and Bertha hesitated a moment in presence of the speechless exasperation which caused the maid to turn ghastly pale. Then she sturdily entered, and disappeared with her black mourning in the shadow of the apartment. Auguste followed her, and the door closed behind them. A deep sigh of relief ascended the staircase and filled the house with joy. The ladies pressed the hands of the priest whose prayers had been granted. Just as Clotilde was taking him off to settle the other matter, Duvarier, who had lagged behind with Léon and Bachelard, arrived walking painfully. The happy result had all to be explained to him, but he, who had been desiring it for months past, scarcely seemed to understand, a strange expression overspreading his face, and his mind a prey to a fixed idea, the torture of which quite absorbed him. Whilst the Josserands regained their apartments, he returned to his own, behind his wife and the priest, and they had just reached the anteroom when some stifled cries caused them to start. "Do not be uneasy, madame. It is the little lady upstairs in labor," Hippolyte complacently explained. "I saw Dr. Jolirat run up just now." Then, when he was alone, he added philosophically, "One goes, another comes." Clotilde made the Abbé Maudoux comfortable in the drawing-room, saying that she would first of all send him Clement, and, to help him to while away the time, she gave him the Revue des Deux Mondes, which contained some really charming verses. She wished to prepare her maid for the interview, but on entering her dressing-room she found her husband seated on a chair. Ever since the morning, Duveyrier had been in a state of agony. For the whole family of hawkers, the mother, the brother, the sisters, had fallen upon him and driven him downstairs with kicks and blows, whilst Clarisse had called him a poverty-stricken wretch and furiously threatened him with the police if he ever dared to show himself there again. It was all over. Down below, the doorkeeper had told him that for a week past a very rich old fellow had been anxious to provide for Madame. Then, driven away and no longer having a warm nook to nestle in, Duveyrier, after wandering about the streets, had entered an out-of-the-way shop and purchased a pocket revolver. Life was becoming too sad. He could at least put an end to it as soon as he had found a suitable place for doing so. This selection of a quiet corner was occupying his mind as he mechanically returned to the Rue de Choiseul to assist at Monsieur Josserand's funeral. Then, when following the corpse, he had had a sudden idea of killing himself at the cemetery. He would go to the furthest end and hide behind a tombstone. This flattered his taste for the romantic, the necessity for a tender ideal, which was wrecking his life beneath his rigid middle-class attitude. But as the coffin was being lowered into the grave, he began to tremble, seized with an earthly chill. The spot would decidedly not do. He would have to seek elsewhere. And, having returned in a worse state than ever, entirely a prey to this one idea, he sat thinking on a chair in the dressing-room, trying to decide which was the most suitable place in the house. Perhaps the bedroom, beside the bed, or simply just where he was, without moving. "Will you have the kindness to leave me to myself?" said Clotilde to him. He already had his hand on the revolver in his pocket. "Why?" asked he with an effort. "Because I wish to be alone." He thought that she wanted to change her dress, and that she would not even let him see her bare arms, so repugnant he felt was he to her. For an instant he looked at her with his dim eyes, and beheld her so tall, so beautiful, with a complexion clear as marble, her hair gathered up in deep golden tresses. Ah! If she had only consented, how everything might have been arranged. He rose stumblingly from his chair and, opening his arms, tried to take hold of her.
"What now?"
murmured she, greatly surprised.
"What's the matter with you?"
"Not here, surely. Have you the other one no longer, then?" "It is going to begin again, that abomination." And she exhibited such utter disgust that he drew back. Without a word, he left her, stopping in the anteroom as he hesitated for a moment. Then, as there was a door facing him, the door of the closet, he pushed it open, and, without the slightest hurry, he sat down. It was a quiet spot. No one would come and disturb him there. He placed the barrel of the little revolver in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Meanwhile, Clotilde, who had been struck since the morning by his strange manner, had listened to ascertain if he were obliging her by returning to Clarisse. On learning where he had gone, by a creak peculiar to that door, she no longer bothered herself about him, and was at length in the act of ringing for Clément, when the dull report of a firearm filled her with surprise. Whatever was it? It was just like the noise a saloon rifle would make. She hastened to the anteroom, not daring at first to question him. Then, as a strange sound issued from where he was, she called him, and, on receiving no answer, opened the door. The bolt had not even been fastened. Duveyrier, stunned by fright more than by the injury he had received, remained squatting in a most lugubrious posture, his eyes wide open and his face streaming with blood. He had missed his object. After grazing his jaw, the bullet had passed out again through the left cheek, and he no longer had the courage to fire a second time. "What? That is what you come to do here?" cried Clotilde, quite beside herself. "Just go and kill yourself outside." She was most indignant. Instead of softening her, this spectacle threw her into a supreme exasperation. She bullied him and raised him up without the least precaution, wishing to carry him away so that no one should see him in such a place. In that closet, and to miss killing himself too. It was too much. Then, whilst she supported him to lead him to the bedroom, Duveyrier, who had his throat filled with blood and whose teeth were dropping out, stuttered between two rattles, "You never loved me." And he burst into sobs. He bewailed the death of poetry, that little blue flower which it had been denied him to pluck. When Clotilde had put him to bed, she at length became softened, seized with a nervous emotion in the midst of her anger. The worst of it was that Clémence and Hippolyte were coming in answer to the bell. She had first talked to them of an accident. Their master had fallen on his chin. Then she was obliged to abandon this fable, for, on going to wipe up the blood, the footman had found the revolver. The wounded man was still losing a great deal of blood, when the maid remembered that Dr. Juerat was upstairs attending to Madame Pichon, and she hastened to him, meeting him on the staircase on his way home after a most successful delivery. The doctor immediately reassured Clotilde. Perhaps the jaw would be slightly out of its place, but her husband's life was not in the least danger. He was proceeding to dress the wound in the midst of basins of water and red-stained rags, when the Abbé Mauduit, uneasy at all this commotion, ventured to enter the room. "Whatever has happened?" asked he. This question completed upsetting Madame Duveyrier. She burst into tears at the first words of explanation. The priest, fully aware of the hidden miseries of his flock, had moreover quite understood matters. Already, whilst waiting in the drawing-room, he had been taken with a feeling of uneasiness, and almost regretted the success which had attended his efforts. That wretched young woman whom he had once more united to her husband without her showing the slightest remorse. He was filled with a terrible doubt. Perhaps God was not with him. And his anguish still further increased as he beheld the counsellor's fractured jaw. He went up to him, bent upon energetically condemning suicide. But the doctor, who was very busy, thrust him aside. "After me, my dear Abbé Mauduit. By and by. You can see very well that he has fainted." And indeed, directly the doctor touched him, Duveyrier had lost consciousness. Then Clotilde, to get rid of the servants who were no longer needed, and whose staring eyes embarrassed her very much, murmured as she wiped her eyes, "Go into the drawing-room. Abbé Mauduit has something to say to you." The priest was obliged to take them there. There was another unpleasant piece of business. Hippolyte and Clémence followed him in profound surprise. When they were alone together, he began preaching them a rather confused sermon. Heaven rewarded good behavior, whereas a single sin led one to hell. Moreover, it was time to put a stop to scandal and to think of one's salvation. Whilst he spoke thus, their surprise turned to bewilderment. With their hands hanging down beside them, she with her slender limbs and tiny mouth, he with his flat face and his big bones like a gendarme, they exchanged anxious glances. Had Madame found some of her napkins upstairs in a trunk, or was it because of the bottle of wine they took up with them every evening? "My children," the priest ended by saying, "you set a bad example. The greatest of crimes is to pervert one's neighbor, and to bring the house where one lives into disrepute. Yes, you live in a disorderly way, unfortunately, is no longer a secret to anyone, for you have been fighting together for a week past." He blushed. A modest hesitation caused him to choose his words. Meanwhile, the two servants had sighed with relief. They smiled now and strutted about in quite a happy manner. It was only that, really, there was no occasion to be so frightened. "But it's all over, sir," declared Clemence, glancing at Hippolyte in the fondest manner. "We have made it up." "Yes, he explained everything to me." The priest in his turn exhibited an astonishment full of sadness. "You do not understand me, my children. You cannot continue to live together. You sin against God and man. You must get married." At this their amazement returned. "Get married? Whatever for?" "I don't want to," said Clemence. "I've quite another idea." Then the Abbé Mauduit tried to convince Hippolyte. "Come, my fine fellow, you who are a man, use your influence with her. Talk to her of her honor. It will change nothing in your mode of living." "Be married?" The footman grinned in a jocular and embarrassed manner. At length he declared, as he looked down at the toes of his boots, "I dare say I don't say the contrary, but I'm already married." This answer put a stop to all the priest's moral preaching. Without adding a word, he folded up his arguments and put religion, now become useless, back into his pocket, deeply regretting ever having risked it in such a disgraceful matter. Clotilde, who rejoined him at this moment, had heard everything, and she gave vent to her indignation in a furious gesture. At her order, the footman and the maid left the room, one behind the other, looking very serious, but in reality feeling highly amused. After a short pause, Abbé Mauduit complained bitterly, "Why expose him in that manner? Why stir up things? It was far better to let rest." The condition of affairs had now become most disgraceful. But Clotilde repeated her gesture. So much the worse. She had far greater worries. Moreover, she would certainly not send the servants away, for fear the whole neighborhood learnt the story of the attempted suicide that very evening. She would decide what to do later on. "You will not forget, will you?" "The most complete repose," urged the doctor, coming from the bedroom. "He will get over it perfectly, but all fatigue must be avoided. Take courage, madame." And, turning toward the priest, he added, "You can preach him a sermon later on, my dear friend. I do not give him up to you yet. If you are returning to St. Roch, I will accompany you. We can walk together." Then they left the house, and slowly followed the Rue Neuve Saint-Augustin. As they raised their heads, on arriving at the end of the street, they beheld Madame Hédouin smiling at them at the door of the Ladies' Paradise. Standing behind her was Octave, also laughing. That very morning they had settled on their marriage, after a serious conversation. They would wait till the autumn, and they were both full of joy at having at length arranged the matter. "Good day, my dear Abbé Mauduit," said Madame Hédouin gaily. "And you, doctor, always paying visits?" And, as the latter congratulated her on her good looks, she added, "Oh, if there were only me, you might give up business at once." They stood conversing a moment. The doctor having mentioned Marie's confinement, Octave seemed delighted to hear of his former neighbor's happy delivery. But when he learnt that it was a third daughter, he exclaimed, "Can't her husband manage a boy, then?" She thought she might still get Monsieur and Madame Vouillon to put up with a boy, but they'll never stomach another girl. "I should think not," said the doctor. "They have both taken to their bed. The news of their daughter's pregnancy upset them so much, and they sent for a notary so that their son-in-law should not even inherit their furniture." There was a little chaff. The priest alone remained silent, with his eyes cast on the ground. Madame Hédouin asked him if he was unwell. Yes, he felt very tired. He was going to take a little rest. And after a cordial exchange of good wishes, he went down the Rue Saint-Roch, still accompanied by the doctor. On arriving before the church, the latter abruptly said, "A bad customer, eh? Who is?" asked the priest in surprise. That lady who sells linen, she does not care a pin for either of us. No need for religion nor for medicine. All the same, when one is always so well, it is no longer interesting." And he went on his way whilst the priest entered the church. Abbe Maudoui intended to go up to his room, but a great agitation, a violent necessity, had forced him to enter the church and kept him there. It seemed to him that God was calling him, with a confused and far-off voice, the orders proceeding from which he was unable to catch. He slowly crossed the church, and was trying to read within himself, to quiet his alarms, when, suddenly, as he passed behind the choir, a superhuman spectacle shook his entire frame. It was beyond the marble chapel of the Virgin, as white as a lily beyond the gold and silver plate of the chapel of the Adoration, with its 7 golden lamps, its golden candelabra, and its golden altar shining in the tawny shadow of the aureate-stained windows. It was in the depths of this mysterious night, past this tabernacle background, a tragical apparition, a simple yet harrowing drama, Christ nailed to the cross, between the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene, weeping at his feet, and the white statues, which an invisible light coming from above caused to stand out from against the bare wall, seemed to advance and increase. The priest, thoroughly distracted, fell on his knees. He had whitened that plaster, arranged that mode of lighting, prepared that phenomenon, and, now that the boarding was removed, the architect and the workmen gone, he was the first to be thunderstruck at the sight. From the terrible severity of the Calvary came a breath which overpowered him. He fancied the Almighty passing over him. He bent beneath this breath, filled with misgivings, tortured by the thought that he was perhaps a bad priest. Chapter 18. In December, the 8th month of her mourning, Madame Josserand for the Duveyriers, almost a family gathering with which Clotilde opened her Saturday receptions of the new winter. The day before, Adele had been told that she would have to help Julie with the washing up. The ladies were in the habit of thus lending their servants to each other on the days when they gave parties. "And above all, try and put a little more go into yourself," said Madame Josserand to her maid-of-all-work. "I don't know what you've got in your body now. You're as limp as rags, yet you're fat and plump." Adele was simply 9 months gone in the family way. For a long time she had thought she was merely growing stouter, which greatly surprised her, however, and she would get into a perfect rage with her ever-hungry empty stomach on the days when Madame triumphantly showed her to her guests. "Ah, well!" Those who accused her of weighing her servants' bread might come and look at that great glutton. It was not likely she got so fat by merely licking the walls. When, in her stupidity, Adele at length became aware of her misfortune, she restrained herself 20 times from telling the truth to her mistress, who was really taking advantage of her condition to make the neighborhood think that she was at length feeding her. But from this moment terror stultified her entirely. Her village ideas once more took possession of her obtuse skull. She thought herself damned. She fancied that the gendarmes would come and take her if she admitted her pregnancy. Then all her low cunning was made use of to hide it. She concealed the feelings of sickness. Twice she thought she would drop down dead before her kitchen fire, while stirring some sauces. The pain that she had endured for the 2 last months with the obstinacy of an heroic silence was indeed frightful. Adele went up to bed that night about 11 o'clock. The thought of tomorrow evening terrified her, more drudgery, more bullying by Julie, and she could scarcely move about. During the night she was seized with labor pains, and a desire came over her to move about so as to walk them off. She therefore lighted the candle and began to wander round the room, her tongue dried up, tormented with a burning thirst, and her cheeks on fire. Hours passed in this cruel wandering, without her daring to put on her shoes, for fear of making a noise, whilst she was only protected against the cold by an old shawl thrown across her shoulders. 2 o'clock struck, then 3 o'clock. Not a soul stirred in the adjoining rooms. Everyone was snoring. She could hear Julie's sonorous hum, whilst Lisa made a kind of hissing noise like the shrill notes of a fife. 4 o'clock had just struck when, seized with a violent pain, she felt that the end was approaching and could not restrain uttering a loud cry. At this, the occupants of the other rooms began to rouse up. Voices thick with sleep were heard saying, "Well, what? Who's being murdered? Someone's being taken by force." "Don't dream out loud like that." Dreadfully frightened, she drew the bedclothes over the newborn child, which was uttering plaintive cries like a little kitten. But she soon heard Julie snoring again, after turning over, whilst Lisa, once more asleep, no longer uttered a sound. Then she experienced an immense relief, an infinite comfort of calm and repose, and lay as one dead. She must have dozed thus for the best part of an hour. When 6 o'clock struck, the consciousness of her position awoke her again. Time was flying. She rose up painfully, and did whatever things came into her head without deciding on them beforehand. A frosty moon shone full into the room. After dressing herself, she wrapped the infant up in some old rags, and then folded a couple of newspapers around it. It uttered no cry now, yet its little heart was beating. Not one of the servants was about as yet, and, after getting slumbering Monsieur Gourde to unfasten the door from his room, she was able to go out and lay her bundle in the Passage Choiseul, the gates of which had just been opened, and then quietly returned upstairs. She met no one. For once in her lifetime, luck was on her side. She immediately set about tidying her room, after which, utterly worn out and as white as wax, she again lay down. It was thus that Madame Josserand found her, when she had made up her mind to go upstairs toward 9 o'clock, greatly surprised at not seeing Adele come down. The servant having complained of a violent attack of diarrhea which had kept her awake all night, Madame exclaimed, "Of course, you must have eaten too much again. You think of nothing else but stuffing yourself." The girl's paleness, however, made her uneasy, and she talked of sending for the doctor. But she was glad to save the 3 francs when Adele vowed that she merely needed rest. Since her husband's death, Madame Josserand had been living with her daughter Hortense on an allowance made her by the brothers Bernheim, but which did not prevent her from bitterly alluding to them as persons who lived on the brains of others, and she spent less than ever on food, so as not to descend to a lower level of society by quitting her apartments and giving up her Tuesday receptions. "That's right. Sleep," said she. "There is some cold beef left which will do for this morning, and tonight we dine out. If you cannot come down to help Julie, she will have to do without you." The dinner that evening at the Duveyriers was a very cordial one. All the family was there, the 2 Vebres and their wives, Madame Josserand, Hortense, Léon, and even Uncle Bachelard, who behaved well. Moreover, they had invited Troublot to fill a vacant place, and Madame d'Amberville, so as not to separate her from Léon. The latter, after his marriage with the niece, had once again fallen into the arms of the aunt, who was still necessary to him. They were seen to arrive together in all the drawing-rooms, and they would apologize for the young wife, whom a cold or a feeling of idleness, said they, kept at home. That evening the whole table complained of scarce knowing her. They loved her so much, she was so beautiful. Then they talked of the chorus which Clotilde was to give at the end of the evening. It was the Blessing of the Daggers, again, but this time with 5 tenors, something complete and magisterial. For 2 months past, Duveyre himself, who had become quite charming, had been looking up the friends of the house and saying to everyone he met, "You are quite a stranger. Come and see us. My wife is going to give her choruses again." Therefore, half through the dinner they talked of nothing but music. The happiest good nature and the most free-hearted gaiety prevailed throughout. Then, after the coffee, and whilst the ladies sat round the drawing-room fire, the gentlemen formed a group in the parlor and began to exchange some grave ideas. The other guests were now arriving, and among the earliest were Campadon, Abbé Mauduit, and Dr. Juillerat, without including the diners, with the exception of Troublot, who had disappeared on leaving the table. They almost immediately commenced talking politics. The debates in the chamber deeply interested the gentlemen, and they had not yet given over discussing the success of the opposition candidates for Paris, all of whom had been returned at the May elections. This triumph of the dissatisfied portion of the middle classes made them feel anxious at heart, in spite of their apparent delight. "Dear me," declared Léon, "Monsieur Thiers is certainly a most talented man, but he puts so much acrimony into his speeches on the Mexican expedition that he quite spoils their effect." He had just been named to a higher appointment, through Madame d'Ambreville's influence, and had at once joined the government party. The only thing that remained in him of the famished demagogue was an unbearable intolerance of all doctrines. "Not long ago you were accusing the government of every sin," said the doctor, smiling. "I hope you at least voted for Monsieur Thiers?" The young man avoided answering. Théophile, whose stomach was no longer able to digest his food, and who was worried with fresh doubts as to his wife's constancy, exclaimed, "I voted for him. When men refuse to live as brothers, so much the worse for them. And so much the worse for you as well, eh?" remarked Duveyrier, who, speaking but little, uttered some very profound observations. Théophile, greatly scared, looked at him. Auguste no longer dared admit that he had also voted for Monsieur Thiers. Then everyone was very much surprised to hear Uncle Bachelard utter a legitimist profession of faith. He thought it the most genteel. Campardon seconded him warmly. He had abstained from voting himself because the official candidate, Monsieur de Wink, did not offer sufficient guarantees as regards religion, and he furiously declaimed against Renan's Life of Jesus, which had recently made its appearance. "It is not the book that should be burnt, it is the author," repeated he. "You are perhaps too radical, my friend," interrupted the priest in a conciliatory tone. "But, indeed, the symptoms are becoming terrible. There is some talk of driving away the Pope. The revolution has invaded Parliament. We're walking on the edge of a precipice." "So much the better," said Dr. Juillerat simply. Then the others all protested. He renewed his attacks against the middle classes, prophesying that there would be a clean sweep the day when the masses wished to enjoy power in their turn, and the others loudly interrupted him, exclaiming that the middle classes represented the virtue, the industry, and the thrift of the nation. Duveyrier was at length able to make himself heard. He owned it before all. He had voted for Monsieur Dewink, not that Monsieur Dewink exactly represented his opinions, but because he was the symbol of order. Yes, the Saturnalia of the Reign of Terror might one day return. Monsieur Rouher, that remarkable statesman who had just succeeded Monsieur Bilot, had formerly prophesied it in the chamber. He concluded with these striking words: "The triumph of the opposition is the preliminary subsidence of the structure. Take care that it does not crush you in falling." The other gentlemen held their peace, with the unavowed fear of having allowed themselves to be carried away even to compromising their personal safety. They beheld workmen begrimed with powder and blood entering their homes, violating their maidservants and drinking their wine. No doubt the emperor deserved a lesson, only they were beginning to regret having given him so severe a one. "Be easy," concluded the doctor scoffingly. "We will manage to save you from the bullets." But he was going too far. They set him down as an original. It was, moreover, thanks to this reputation for originality that he did not lose his connection. He continued by resuming with Abbé Mauduit their eternal quarrel respecting the approaching downfall of the church. Léon now sided with the priest. He talked of Providence, and on Sundays accompanied Madame d'Ambreville to 9 o'clock Mass. Meanwhile the guests continued to arrive. The drawing-room was becoming quite filled with ladies. Valerie and Berthe were exchanging little secrets like two good friends. The other Madame Camperdown, whom the architect had brought no doubt in place of poor Rose, who was already in bed upstairs and reading Dickens, was giving Madame Josserand an economical recipe for washing clothes without soap, whilst Hortense, seated all by herself and expecting Verdier, did not take her eyes off the door. But suddenly Clotilde, while conversing with Madame d'Amberville, rose up and held out her hands. Her friend, Madame Octave Mouret, had just entered the room. The marriage had taken place early in November at the end of her mourning. "And your husband?" asked the hostess. "He is not going to disappoint me, I hope." "No, no," answered Caroline with a smile. "He will be here directly. Something detained him at the last moment." There was some whispering. Glances full of curiosity were directed toward her, so calm and so lovely, ever the same, with the pleasant assurance of a woman who succeeds in everything she undertakes. Madame Josserand pressed her hand, as though she were delighted to see her again. Berthe and Valerie left off talking and examined her at their ease, studying her costume, a straw-colored dress covered with lace. But in the midst of this quiet forgetfulness of the past, Auguste, whom the political discussion had left quite cool, was giving signs of indignant amazement as he stood near the parlor door. What? His sister was going to receive the family of his wife's former lover. And in his marital rancor, there was a touch of the jealous anger of the tradesman ruined by a triumphant competition, for the Ladies' Paradise, by extending its business and creating a special department for silk, had so drained his resources that he had been obliged to take a partner. He drew near and, whilst everyone was making much of Madame Mouret, he whispered to Clotilde, "You know, I will never put up with it." "Put up with what?" asked she, greatly surprised. "I do not mind the wife so much. She has not done me any harm. But if the husband comes, I shall take hold of Berthe by the arm and leave the room in the presence of everybody." She looked at him, and then shrugged her shoulders. Caroline was her oldest friend. She was certainly not going to give up seeing her, just to satisfy his caprices. As though anyone even recollected the matter. He would do far better not to rake up things forgotten by everybody but himself. And as, deeply affected, he looked to Berthe for support, expecting that she would get up and follow him at once, she calmed him with a frown. Was he mad? Did he wish to make himself more ridiculous than he had ever been before? "But it is in order that I may not appear ridiculous," replied he in despair. Then Madame Josserand inclined toward him and said in a severe tone of voice, "It is becoming quite indecent. Everyone is looking at you. Do behave yourself for once in a way." He held his tongue, but without submitting. From this moment a certain uneasiness existed among the ladies. The only one who preserved her smiling tranquillity was Madame Mouret, now sitting beside Clotilde and opposite Berthe. They watched Auguste, who had retired to the window recess where his marriage had been decided not so very long before. His anger was bringing on a headache, and he now and again pressed his forehead against the icy cold panes. Octave did not arrive till very late. As he reached the landing, he met Madame Jugeur, who had just come down, wrapped in a shawl. She complained of her chest, and had got up on purpose not to disappoint the Duveyriers. Her languid state did not prevent her falling into the young man's arms as she congratulated him on his marriage. "How delighted I am with such a splendid result, my friend! Really! I was quite in despair about you. I never thought you would have succeeded. Tell me, you rascal, how did you manage to get over her?" Octave smiled and kissed her fingers. But someone who was bounding upstairs with the agility of a goat disturbed them, and, greatly surprised, they fancied they recognized Saturnin. It was indeed Saturnin, who a week before had left the Asile des Moulineaux, where for a second time Dr. Chassagne declined to detain him any longer, still considering him not sufficiently mad. No doubt he was going to spend the evening with Marie Pichon, just as in former days when his parents had company, and those bygone times were suddenly evoked. Octave could hear an expiring voice coming from above, singing the ballad with which Marie whiled away her vacant hours. He beheld her once more eternally alone, beside the crib in which Lilith slumbered, and awaiting Jules' return with all the complacency of a gentle and useless woman. "I wish you every happiness with your wife," repeated Madame Jouzer, tenderly squeezing Octave's hands. In order not to enter the drawing-room with her, he was purposely occupying some time in removing his overcoat, when Troublot, in his dress clothes, bareheaded and looking quite upset, came from the passage leading to the kitchen. "You know she's not at all well," murmured he, whilst Hippolyte announced Madame Jouzer. "Who isn't?" asked Octave. "Why, Adele, the servant upstairs." Hearing there was something the matter with her, he had gone up quite paternally on leaving the dinner-table. It must have been a very severe attack of cholerine. A good glass of mulled wine was what she ought to have, and she had not even a lump of sugar. Then, as he noticed that his friend smiled in an indifferent sort of way, he added, "Hello, I forgot you're married, you joker. This sort of thing no longer interests you." "I never thought of that when I found you with Madame. Anything you like except that." They entered together. The ladies were just then speaking of their servants, and were taking such interest in the conversation that they did not notice them at first. All were complacently approving Madame Duveyrier, who was trying to explain, in an embarrassed way, why she continued to keep Clément and Hippolyte. He was rough, but she dressed her so well that one could not help shutting one's eyes to other matters. Neither Valerie nor Berthe could succeed in securing a decent girl. They had given it up in despair, after trying every registry office, the good-for-nothing servants from which had done no more than pass through their kitchens. Madame Josserand violently abused Adele, of whom she related some fresh, abominable, and stupid doings of extraordinary character, and yet she did not send her about her business. As for the other Madame Campardon, she was quite enthusiastic in her praises of Lisa. A pearl, not a thing to reproach her with. In short, one of those deserving domestics to whom one gives prizes. "She is quite one of the family now," said she. "Our little Angèle is attending some lectures at the Hôtel de Ville, and Lisa accompanies her." "Oh, they might remain out together for days. We should not be in the least anxious." It was at this moment that the ladies caught sight of Octave. He was advancing to wish Clotilde good evening. Berthe looked at him. Then, without the least affectation, she resumed her conversation with Valerie, who had exchanged with him the affectionate glance of disinterested friendship. The others, Madame Josserand, Madame d'Ambreville, without throwing themselves at him, surveyed him with sympathetic interest. "So here you are at last," said Clotilde, who was most amiable. I was beginning to tremble for the chorus. And, as Madame Mouret gently scolded her husband for being so late, he made some excuses. "But, my dear, I was unable to come sooner. I am most sorry, madame. However, I am now entirely at your disposal." Meanwhile, the ladies were anxiously watching the window recess into which Auguste had retired. They received a momentary fright when they beheld him turn round at the sound of Octave's voice. His headache was no doubt worse. He had a restless look about the eyes, which seemed full of the darkness of the street. He at length appeared to make up his mind, and, returning to his former position beside his sister's chair, he said, "Send them away, or else we will leave." Clotilde again shrugged her shoulders. Then Auguste seemed disposed to give her time to consider. He would wait a few minutes longer, more especially as Troublot had taken Octave into the parlor. The other ladies were still uneasy, for they had heard the husband whisper in his wife's ear, "If he comes back here, you must get up and follow me, otherwise you may return to your mother's." In the parlor, the gentleman greeted Octave quite as cordially. If Léon made a point of showing a little coolness, Uncle Bachelard and even Théophile seemed to declare, as they held out their hands to Octave, that the family forgot everything. He congratulated Campardon, who, decorated 2 days previously, now wore a broad red ribbon, and the beaming architect scolded him for never calling now and then to pass an hour with his wife. Though one got married, it was scarcely nice to forget friends of 15 years' standing. But the young man felt quite surprised and anxious as he stood before Duveyrier. He had not seen him since his recovery. He looked uneasily at his jaw, all out of place, dropping too much on the left side, and which now gave a horrid, squinting expression to his countenance. Then, when the councillor spoke, he had another surprise. His voice had lowered 2 tones. It had become quite sepulchral. "Don't you think him much better thus?" said Troublot to Octave, as they returned to the drawing-room door. "It positively gives him a certain majestic air. I saw him presiding at the assizes the day before yesterday. Listen, they are talking of it." And indeed the gentlemen had abandoned politics to take up morality. They were listening to Duveyrier as he gave some details of an affair in which his attitude had been particularly noticed. He was even about to be named a president and an officer of the Legion of Honor. It was respecting an infanticide already a year old. The unnatural mother, a regular savage, as he said, happened to be the boot-stitcher, his former tenant, that tall, pale, and friendless girl whose pregnant condition had roused Monsieur Gord's indignation so much. And besides that, she was altogether stupid, for, without reflecting that her appearance would betray her, she had gone and cut her child in 2 and kept it at the bottom of a bonnet-box. She had naturally told the jury quite a ridiculous romance, a seducer who had deserted her, misery, hunger, and then a fit of mad despair on seeing herself unable to supply the little one's wants. In a word, the same story they all told. But it was necessary to make an example. Duveyrier congratulated himself on having summed up with that lucidity which often decided a jury's verdict. "And what was your sentence?" asked the doctor. 5 years, replied the councillor in his new voice, which seemed both hoarse and sepulchral. "It is time to oppose a dike to the debauchery which threatens to submerge Paris." Troublot nudged Octave's elbow. They were both acquainted with the facts of the attempt at suicide. "Eh? You hear him?" murmured he. "Without joking, it improves his voice. It stirs one more, does it not? It goes straight to the heart now. Ah, if you had only seen him standing up, draped in his long red robes, with his mug all askew. On my word, he quite frightened me. He was extraordinary. Oh, you know, a style in his majesty enough to make your flesh creep." But he left off speaking and listened to the ladies in the drawing-room, who were again on the subject of servants. That very morning Madame de Virier had given Julie a week's notice. She had nothing, certainly, to say against the girl's cooking, only good behavior came before everything in her eyes. The truth was that, warned by Dr. Juillerat and anxious for the health of her son, whose little goings-on she tolerated at home so as to keep them under control, she had had an explanation with Julie, who had been unwell for some time past, and the latter, like a genteel cook whose style was not to quarrel with her employers, had accepted her week's notice. Madame Josserand at once shared Clotilda's indignation. Yes, one should be very strict on the question of morality. For instance, if she kept that slut Adèle in spite of her dirty ways and her stupidity, it was because the girl was virtuous. Oh, on that point she had nothing whatever to reproach her with. Poor Adèle! "When one only thinks," murmured Troublot, again affected at the thought of the wretched creature, half frozen upstairs beneath her thin blanket. Then, bending toward Octave's ear, he added with a chuckle, "I say, Duveyrier might at least take her up a bottle of claret." "Yes, gentlemen," the councillor was continuing, "statistics will bear me out. The crime of infanticide is increasing in the most frightful proportions." Sentiment prevails to too great an extent in the present day, and far too much consideration is shown to science, to your pretended physiology, all of which will end by their soon being neither good nor evil. One cannot cure debauchery, the thing is to destroy it at its root. This refutation was addressed above all to Dr. Juillerat, who had wished to give a medical explanation of the boot-stitcher's case. The other gentlemen also exhibited great severity and disgust. Camperdown could not understand vice. Uncle Bachelard defended infancy. Théophile demanded an inquiry. Léon discussed the question of prostitution in its relations with the state, whilst Troublot, in answer to an inquiry of Octave's, talked of Duverrier's new mistress, who was a decent sort of a woman this time, rather mature, but romantic, with a soul expanded by that ideal which the counsellor required to purify love. In short, a worthy person who gave him a peaceful home, imposing upon him as much as she liked and sleeping with his friends, without making any unnecessary fuss. And the Abbé Mauduit alone remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground, his mind sorely troubled and full of an infinite sadness. They were now about to sing the Blessing of the Daggers. The drawing-room had filled up. A flood of rich dresses was crushing in the brilliant light from the chandelier and the lamps, whilst gay bursts of laughter ran along the rows of chairs, and, in the midst of the buzz, Clotilde in a low voice roughly chided Auguste, who, on seeing Octave enter with the other gentlemen of the chorus, had caught hold of Bertha's arm to make her leave her seat. But he was already beginning to yield, feeling more and more embarrassed in the presence of the lady's dumb disapproval, whilst his head had become entirely the prey of triumphant neuralgia. Madame d'Ambreville's stern looks quite drove him to despair, and even the other Madame Camperdown was against him. It was reserved to Madame Josserand to finish him off. She abruptly interfered, threatening to take back her daughter and never to pay him the 50,000 francs dowry, for she was always promising this dowry with the greatest coolness imaginable. Then, turning toward Uncle Bachelard, seated behind her, and next to Madame Juzer, she made him renew his promises. The uncle placed his hand on his heart. He knew his duty, the family before everything. Auguste, repulsed on all sides, beat a retreat and again sought refuge in the window recess, where he once more pressed his burning forehead against the icy cold panes. Then Octave experienced a singular sensation, as though his Paris life was beginning over again. It was as though the 2 years he had lived in the Rue de Choiseul had been a blank. His wife was there, smiling at him, and yet nothing seemed to have passed in his existence. Today was the same as yesterday. There was neither pause nor ending. Troublot showed him the new partner standing beside Bertha, a little fair fellow, very neat in his ways, who gave her, it was said, no end of presents. Uncle Bachelard, who was now going in for poetry, was revealing himself in a sentimental light to Madame Juzer, whom he quite affected with some intimate details respecting Fifi and Guelin. Théophile, devoured by doubts, doubled up by violent fits of coughing, was imploring Dr. Juillerat in an out-of-the-way corner to give his wife something to quiet her. Camperdown, his eyes fixed on Cousin Gasparine, was talking of the diocese of Évreux, and jumping from that to the great works of the new Rue du Dix Décembre, defending God and art, sending the world about its business, for at heart he did not care a hang for it. He was an artist. And behind a flower stand there could even be seen the back of a gentleman, whom all the marriageable girls contemplated with an air of profound curiosity. It was Verdier who was talking with Hortense, the pair of them having an acrimonious explanation, again putting off their marriage till the spring, so as not to turn the woman and her child into the street in the depth of winter. Then the chorus was sung afresh. The architect, with his mouth wide open, gave out the first line. Clotilde struck a chord and uttered her cry, and the other voices burst forth. The uproar increased little by little, and spread with a violence that scared the candles and caused the ladies to turn pale. Troublot, having been found wanting among the basses, was being tried a second time as a baritone. The 5 tenors were much noticed, Octave especially, to whom Clotilde regretted being unable to give a solo. When the voices fell and she had applied the soft pedal, imitating the cadenced and distant footsteps of a departing patrol, the applause was deafening, and she, together with the gentlemen, had every praise showered upon them. And at the farthest end of the adjoining room, right behind a triple row of men in evening dress, one beheld Duveyrier clenching his teeth so as not to cry aloud with anguish, with his mouth all on one side, and his festering eruptions almost bleeding. The tea, coming next, unrolled the same procession, distributed the same cups and the same sandwiches. For a moment, the Abbé Mauduit found himself once more in the middle of the deserted drawing-room. He looked through the wide-open door on the crush of guests, and vanquished he smiled. He again cast the mantle of religion over this corrupt middle-class society, like a master in the ceremonies draping the canker to stave off the final decomposition. He must save the church, as heaven had not answered his cry of misery and despair. At length, the same as on every Saturday, when midnight struck, the guests began to withdraw. Campardin was among the first to leave, with the other Madame Campardin. Léon and Madame d'Ambreville were not long in maritally following them. Verdier's back had long ago disappeared, when Madame Josserand went off with Hortense, bullying her for what she called her romantic obstinacy. Uncle Bachelard, very drunk from the punch he had taken, detained Madame Juzer a moment at the door, finding her advice full of experience, quite refreshing. Troublot, who had stolen some sugar for Adele, was making for the passage leading to the kitchen, when the presence of Berthe and Auguste in the ante-room embarrassed him, and he pretended to be looking for his hat. But just at this minute, Octave and his wife, escorted by Clotilde, also came out and asked for their wraps. There ensued a few seconds of embarrassment. The anteroom was not large. Berthe and Madame Mouret were pressed against each other, whilst Hippolyte was searching for their things. They both smiled. Then, when the door was opened, the 2 men, Octave and Auguste, brought face to face, did the polite, each stepping aside. At length Berthe consented to pass out first after an exchange of bows. And Valérie, who was leaving in her turn with Théophile, again looked at Octave in the affectionate way of a disinterested friend. He and she alone might have told each other everything. "Goodbye," repeated Clotilde graciously to the 2 families, before returning to the drawing-room. Octave stopped short. He had just caught sight on the next floor of the partner, the neat little fair fellow, taking his departure like the rest, and whose hands Saturnine, who had just left Marie, was pressing in an outburst of savage tenderness, stuttering the while, "Friend, friend, friend, friend." A singular feeling of jealousy at first darted through him. Then he smiled. It was the past, and he again recalled his amours, all his campaign of Paris, the complacencies of that good little Pichon, the repulse he received from Valérie, of whom he preserved a pleasant recollection, his stupid connection with Berthe, which he regretted as pure waste of time. Now he had transacted his business. Paris was conquered, and he gallantly followed her, whom in his heart he still styled Madame Hédouin, every now and then stooping to see that the train of her dress did not catch in the stair-rods. The house had once more resumed its grand air of middle-class dignity. He fancied he could hear Marie's distant and expiring ballad. Beneath the porch he met Jules coming in. Madame Vuillaume was at death's door, and refused to see her daughter. Then that was all. The doctor and the priest retired last, and still arguing, Troublot had shyly gone up to Adele to attend to her, and the deserted staircase slumbered in a heavy warmth with its chased doors enclosing respectable alcoves. 1 o'clock was striking when Monsieur Gourde, whom Madame Gourde was snugly awaiting in bed, turned out the gas. Then the whole house lapsed into silent darkness, as though annihilated by the decency of its sleep. Nothing remained. Life resumed its level of indifference and stupidity. On the following morning, Adele dragged herself down to her kitchen so as to allay suspicion. A thaw had set in during the night, and she opened the window, feeling stifled when Hippolyte's voice rose furiously from the depths of the narrow courtyard. "You dirty hussies! Who has been emptying her slops out of the window again? Madame's dress is quite spoilt." He had hung out one of Madame Duverier's dresses given him to brush, and he found it all spattered with sour broth. Then, from the top to the bottom, the servants appeared at their windows and violently exculpated themselves. The sluice was open, and a rush of the most abominable words flowed from the foul spot. In times of thaw, the walls were steeped with humidity, and quite a pestilence ascended from the obscure little courtyard, all the hidden corruptions of the different floors seeming to melt and ooze out by this common sewer of the house. "It wasn't me," said Adele, leaning out. "I've only just come." Lisa abruptly raised her head. "Hello, so you're on your legs again. Well, what was the matter? Is it true that you almost croaked?" "Oh, yes, I had such colics, and not at all funny, I can tell you." This put a stop to the quarrel. Valerie and Berthé's new servants, a big camel and a little jade as they were termed, looked curiously at Adèle's pale face. Victoire and Julie also wished to see her, and stretched their necks and leant their heads back. They all had an idea that there was something wrong, for it was unnatural to have such gripes and yell out as she did.
"Perhaps you've had something which didn't agree with you,"
said Lisa. The others burst out laughing. Another rush of foul language overflowed, whilst the wretched creature, awfully frightened, stammered, "Hold your tongues with your nasty words. I'm quite ill enough as it is. You don't want to finish me off, do you?" No, of course not. She was as stupid could be, and dirty enough to disgust a whole neighborhood, but they all held too closely together to bring her into any trouble. And they naturally turned to abusing their masters and mistresses. They criticized the party of the previous evening with looks of profound repugnance. "So they've all made it up again now?" asked Victoire as she sipped her glass of syrup and brandy. Hippolyte, who was wiping Madame's dress, replied, "They've no more heart than my shoes. When they've spat in one another's faces, they wash themselves with it, to make one believe they're clean." "They must manage to agree somehow or other," said Lisa. "Otherwise it wouldn't take long before our turn came." But there was a moment of panic. A door opened, and the servants were already diving back into their kitchens, when Lisa announced that it was only little Angèle. There was nothing to fear with her, she understood. And from the foul spout there again arose all the rancor of the domestics, in the midst of the poisonous stench caused by the thaw. There was a grand spreading out of all the dirty linen of the last 2 years. It was quite consoling not to be ladies and gentlemen, when one beheld the masters and mistresses living in the midst of it all, and apparently enjoying it, as they were preparing to go through it all again. I say, you up there," suddenly shouted Victoire. "Was it with Montesquieu that you had what didn't agree with you?" At this, a ferocious yell of delight quite shook the stinking cesspool. Hippolyte actually tore Madame's dress, but he did not care. It was far too good for her as it was. The big camel and the little jade were bent over the handrails of their windows, wriggling in a mad burst of laughter. Adele, however, who was quite scared and who was half asleep through weakness, started, and she retorted in the midst of the jeers, "You're all of you heartless things. When you're dying, I'll come and dance at your bedsides." "Ah, mademoiselle," resumed Lisa, leaning out to speak to Julie, "how happy you must feel at leaving such a wretched house in a week. On my word, one becomes wicked here in spite of oneself. I wish you a better home in your next place." Julie, her arms bare and dripping with the blood from a turbot she had been just cleaning for that evening's dinner, returned to the window beside the footman. She shrugged her shoulders and concluded with this philosophical reply, "Dear me, mademoiselle, here or there, they're all alike. In the present day, whoever has been in the one has been in the other. It's